There's a certain irony in being born into a world where your first lullaby is wind scraping through hide tents, and the second is someone sharpening a knife. No one asked if you wanted to become a hunter. The world simply assumed you would. On the northern plains, in the subarctic forests, in the birch-shadowed lands of the Great Lakes, the cry of a newborn wasn't cooed over. It was politely acknowledged, then promptly muffled before it scared off the nearby game. Childhood started with an apology to nature for the noise. From the beginning, everything was practical. Babies weren't left to fatten in cribs. They were wrapped tight in cradleboards, slung over a mother's back, and carried across distances that would make a modern hiker whimper. There were no baby toys, unless you counted a smooth stone to gnaw on while your parents stalked elk. Early life was less about comfort and more about endurance. Even the lullabies, soft, rhythmic, half-hummed prayers, carried the quiet warning that warmth was temporary and movement was survival. A hunter's birthright wasn't land or wealth, it was motion. The ground itself was a classroom. The first thing a child saw was smoke from the cooking fire, twisting into sky, a reminder that everything living was meant to rise, and then vanish. The second was the animal being skinned nearby, its blood steaming in the cold. Nothing about this was sentimental. The dead animal was not a friend. It was food, clothing, and ceremony. And in that world, ceremony was just another way of saying respect with consequences. Across the Great Plains, Lakota and Cheyenne mothers whispered names that meant strong wind, fast hoof, returns with meat. Names were not cute. They were prophecies under construction, revised each winter depending on how well you survived the last one. The logic was simple. If the buffalo didn't get to rest, neither did you. In the subarctic, Cree and Dean children learned early that walking quietly could mean the difference between a meal and a long, freezing prayer for one. There was no audience, no applause, just the echo of boots in snow and the kind of silence that tested your worth. To be born into the hunt meant being born into responsibility long before you could hold anything sharper than a bone spoon. While European infants were being christened into futures involving property disputes and powdered wigs, native infants were being smeared with animal fat to protect their skin from windburn and bad spirits. Both rituals, in their own way, prepared the child for judgment. Only one of them had to worry about wolves. There was a hierarchy, of course. The first cry proved you were alive. The next winters proved you deserved to stay that way. Death was casual company, and birth wasn't a guarantee of anything more than a chance to keep trying. Among the Plains people, survival was the first sacred act. Everything else, including belief, language, and honor, came later. Infancy wasn't a protected state. It was a brief grace period before life began testing your ability to adapt to hunger, cold, and expectation. And expectation was heavy. Every child was a potential provider, a future guardian of the camp, a small body destined to grow into someone who could track a herd across miles of open prairie without leaving prints. The village didn't raise hunters, it raised balance keepers, people who could kill without greed, protect without tyranny, and endure without complaint. The irony, of course, was that you learned all that before you ever learned to speak. Words came second. Observation came first. Because in a world where meat spoiled fast and winters lasted forever, you didn't learn to talk before you learned to listen, especially to the silence that followed a missed arrow. And that silence, cold and endless, was the true beginning of education. There's a kind of discipline that comes from growing up in a place where everything that moves could either feed you or kill you, sometimes both, depending on your luck. Childhood for a native hunter wasn't about discovery. It was about calibration. You didn't learn the world. You tuned yourself to it. Every rustle, every gust, every shadow was data. If modern education was about memorizing facts, this was about remembering what could eat you. Play, if it existed, was suspiciously similar to work. Boys didn't play tag, they practiced ambush. Girls didn't play house, they practiced survival. A game of let's pretend usually ended with someone bringing back an actual squirrel. The toy bows were real, just smaller. The arrows, dull only because nobody wanted to explain to your mother why her son came home with a hole in him. By the time you were 5, you could identify a deer trail faster than most modern adults can find Wi-Fi. By 7, you were already following your father's footsteps into the woods, being told the single most repeated phrase in the hunting world, quietly now. It wasn't silence for politeness. Silence was survival. To speak too loud was to warn the thing you needed to eat that you were bad at it. In many plains and woodland nations, Lakota, Cree, Ojibwe, Pawnee, children were trained to watch and imitate. Adults didn't give long explanations. They demonstrated. You watched how a hunter's knees bent, how his breath slowed before the shot, how he never looked directly at the prey, but just beside it. Observation was education, and every mistake had a cost that didn't require grading, just hunger. Discipline began with tiny humiliations. Miss a rabbit, you might go hungry that evening. Step on a twig while tracking. Everyone knew, and you'd get a look that said, "We'll discuss this later." But punishment wasn't cruel. It was efficient. The environment didn't tolerate sloppiness, so neither did the people who lived in it. To be scolded by an elder wasn't an insult. It was an investment. Each lecture came with the unspoken understanding that they were training you to outlive them. And while the boys learned to track, climb, and throw, the girls learned something equally brutal: efficiency, skinning, cutting, preserving, curing, all before adolescence. It was a world where nobody was useless, and the only childhood dream was competence. Affection came in strange forms. Your father quietly nodding after you hit a target. Your mother saving the thickest cut of meat for you after a long day. No one said, "I'm proud of you." They just handed you a bigger bow. Even the rhythm of growing up was dictated by the land's demands. Winter meant trapping small game. Spring meant fishing and building. Summer meant the long hunt, weeks or months away from camp, following the herds until your muscles forgot what rest felt like. Each season was a test, and failure was public. Success, too, was public, but quickly forgotten, because the next test was already waiting. There was humor, though sharp, dry, and often at your expense. An elder might joke that a young hunter couldn't sneak up on a blind moose, and everyone would laugh, including you. Because embarrassment, like hunger, was part of the curriculum. It kept the ego from getting in the way of the work. Modesty wasn't a virtue. It was insurance against arrogance, which tended to get people trampled or shot. By the time childhood ended, you weren't sentimental about it. You didn't leave innocence behind because you never had time to keep it. You grew into alertness, into competence, into the quiet awareness that your existence was constantly being weighed against the precision of your arrow and the steadiness of your hand. And if you were lucky, very lucky, you'd earn the simplest compliment a hunter could get from an elder: a small nod, a grunt, and a phrase that meant everything. You're ready. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't need language, the kind that listens to the ground breathe. For the hunter, education didn't happen in huts or under the authority of priests. It unfolded in wind direction, hoofprints, and the patience to wait 3 hours for something that might not appear. The senses weren't 5 polite categories. They were survival systems wired into the bones. Sight wasn't just sight, it was the ability to notice a single misplaced blade of grass and know which way the deer went. Hearing wasn't just sound, it was hearing the way silence changed when something alive entered it. A hunter's vision came from staring at horizons until the eyes learned how to separate motion from heat. They learned to read mirages like maps. Plains hunters, for example, could spot a buffalo herd from miles away, not by seeing the animals directly, but by recognizing the shimmering waves of heat their bodies made above the earth. The subarctic Cree tracked moose by the sound of their breath in frozen air, short, rhythmic, almost polite puffs of steam between trees. This was education with no textbooks, just repetition and the threat of hunger. And smell. Modern people forget that smell was once strategy. Hunters could tell what grazed nearby by scent alone. A whiff of musk and dirt meant deer. Wet grass and dung meant bison had passed hours before. Even water had personality. Stagnant pools smelled of insects. Flowing streams smelled clean. Snow smelled like nothing, which was precisely the point. It meant purity, safety. The nose was a compass, and the wind was a messenger. You learned to test it like you'd test a mood. Touch was equally holy. Barefoot walking trained the feet to feel what eyes couldn't see. Vibration, temperature, texture. Hunters felt the hum of life through the soles of their feet, distinguishing between earths softened by rain and the compacted ground of a recent animal trail. Gloves were for the uninitiated. Skin was an instrument. And with time, the hunter's body learned to predict what the mind hadn't yet noticed. Goosebumps became a warning. A chill up the spine meant something moved, perhaps not dangerous, but alive enough to matter. The ear, though, was the real philosopher. It had to tell the difference between the sound of leaves moving in wind and leaves moved by breath, between the wing beat of a crow and the wing beat of a hawk. In the dense forests of the northeast, the Haudenosaunee could identify the distance of footsteps on damp soil just by the pitch of the sound. On the open plains, a skilled listener could estimate the number of horses in a distant raiding party by the rhythm of their gallop, a gift that made the difference between staying and running. And of course, there was that sixth sense, the one modern people call intuition because they've forgotten how to name it properly. It was the silent mathematics of pattern recognition, the ability to sense danger before it arrived, to feel the heaviness in the air when predators were near. Among Inuit and Dean hunters, it wasn't mystical, it was learned. If the dogs grew restless or birds went still, you stopped moving. If the air changed weight, you waited. The world spoke in subtle tones. The hunter's mind had to translate. The irony is that civilization tends to dull what the wild refines. The hunter's schooling turned the body into a kind of living sensor array, a system tuned to detect survival's smallest cues. A muscle twitch, a sound, a smell, all could mean life or death. There was no mindfulness fad here, only pure necessity. Awareness wasn't spiritual, it was insurance. And when you'd finally mastered the art of noticing everything, you were allowed to touch the sacred things, the tools that would make your noticing lethal. The tools of a hunter weren't just objects, they were biographies. Every weapon told a story about the person who made it, the animal it killed, and the prayer that came before both. Nothing was store-bought or symbolic. Every edge and fiber was an argument for competence. A bow wasn't a weapon so much as an extension of the body, shaped to one's draw strength, one's height, even one's temperament. On the plains, they favored shorter, sinew-backed bows that could be used from horseback, the kind that snapped an arrow clean through a running bison's ribcage. In the forests, where the trees were close and movement slow, the bows were long, flexible, and silent. Geography wrote the instruction manual. Arrows were built like sentences. Every part had to agree with the next. Shafts of ash or dogwood, straightened with steam and patience, fletched with feathers that spiraled in perfect spin. The heads, obsidian, flint, or later iron from traders, were sharpened until they could shave bark or skin with equal ease. Each arrow was personal. You didn't borrow another hunter's arrows any more than you'd borrow his voice. When they flew, they carried your intention, and if that intention was sloppy, the world had ways of reminding you to do better. Knives were religion. A hunter might own one his whole life, sharpening it until the blade was thin as a memory. They dressed hides, carved meat, and doubled as mirrors for checking if you'd still looked alive after winter. Some were crafted from antler or bone, others forged in fire and trade. But each one had its place tied to the belt, sheathed in tanned hide, polished with oil and respect. The edge was sacred. To dull it was almost a moral offense, like wasting food or mocking thunder. Then there were the traps, simple, clever, and occasionally cruel. Deadfalls, snares, pit traps lined with sharpened stakes. These weren't inventions of convenience, they were technologies of patience. In the subarctic, trappers set dozens of snares along frozen trails, marking them with symbols invisible to outsiders. Each snare was a handshake with hunger. You left something out there in the cold and trusted it would repay you. Sometimes it didn't. The forest didn't sign contracts, and when metal arrived through trade, things changed, not immediately, but inevitably. Iron points replaced stone. Copper pots became prizes. Muskets appeared, clumsy and loud, admired and mistrusted in equal measure. Some tribes, like the Cree and Ojibwe, became masters of the gun trade. Others treated it like a necessary evil. Powder, after all, could get wet. A bow never misfired in the rain. Still, there was no denying the power a musket could bring down a moose from farther away than any arrow could dream. Progress, as always, came with noise. Even horses were tools, living, breathing, machines of mobility and danger. The arrival of horses from Spanish stock in the 17th century transformed hunting on the plains into something faster, deadlier, and far more beautiful. Mounted hunters learned to ride bareback, to hang off the side of the horse while loosing arrows at full gallop, to turn the act of killing into choreography. It was mastery and madness at once, elegance measured in heartbeats and hooves, but tools came with ethics. You didn't use them carelessly. Among the Lakota and Blackfoot, even a broken arrow was treated with care, burned or buried, not discarded. tools held spirit. The hunter didn't own them. He borrowed their sharpness from the world. And every now and then, when the kill was clean and the meat was rich, he'd whisper thanks to the thing that helped him take life. Because in a world where steel and sinew decided who lived through winter, gratitude was the closest thing to grace. And the moment you finished polishing that blade or stringing that bow, you'd feel the pull, the quiet demand of the land asking, "Can you still read me?" Because the next step after building the tools was remembering where and how to use them. To read the land was to read something alive, a text that changed between dawn and dusk, between snow and thaw. It wasn't a landscape. It was a language with its own grammar, and getting it wrong could mean starvation. Hunters didn't walk on the earth so much as through it, like moving through the pages of a book you could only understand if you stopped talking. The land didn't reward curiosity. It rewarded comprehension. A skilled tracker could tell a week's story from a single patch of mud. The way grass bent, the freshness of dung, the depth of a print, all clues in a detective novel that ended, ideally, with dinner. On the open plains, reading meant distance. You learned to recognize the faint smudge of dust that meant buffalo, or the sharp line of darker green where the herds had grazed too long. In the subarctic, reading meant patience. The Cree hunters studied snow, hard-packed trails, melted hollows where moose had slept, faint yellow stains that meant life had passed here recently and left a calling card. In the dense forests of the northeast, every broken twig was punctuation. Every birdsong was an edit to the story you thought you knew. But this literacy wasn't taught formally. No lectures, no diagrams. A boy followed his elders in silence, noticing what they noticed and pretending he always had. "Look with the corners of your eyes," they'd say, which sounded like poetry but was just ergonomics. Staring directly made you miss motion. Peripheral vision caught what mattered. It was an optical trick and a metaphor all at once. Hunters learned not to confront nature but to stand slightly beside it. Never the center of the frame, always the observer in the edge of the shot. Weather was part of the script. You could smell snow hours before it fell, taste iron in the wind before a storm. Clouds moved like mood swings, layered, heavy, full of meaning. A thin halo around the moon meant frost by morning. A sky without birds meant something big was wrong. If modern people rely on forecasts, hunters relied on familiarity, the intimacy of repetition. After a few years, you didn't predict the weather. You remembered it. Even time had geography. Shadows told hours. Moss told direction. The world wasn't divided into minutes, but into tasks. Skinning time, trapping time, thawing time. You didn't ask, "What time is it?" You asked, "How far has the light moved?" That's how people who didn't invent clocks still managed to live longer than those who did. Every region had its quirks. The Blackfoot learned to follow buffalo migration routes that moved like slow breathing, north in spring, south in winter. The Ojibwe memorized lakes like constellations, each with a personality, some generous, some deceitful, some haunted by bad fishing luck. The Apache could move through canyons so efficiently they seemed to vanish. Not magic, just cartography learned on foot. The land wasn't a backdrop. It was a character with moods and grudges. You didn't just follow animals. You followed their memories, where they had been, where they might be. If a herd vanished, you didn't panic. You retraced its favorite food. Buffalo liked low grass and good escape routes. Deer liked cover. Elk liked pretending they were clever. To know the land was to know the appetites of others, a kind of empathy enforced by hunger. And still, the best hunters never boasted about it. They knew how small they were compared to what they walked on. You could read every sign correctly and still lose the trail, still starve, still die. The earth didn't care how literate you were. It kept writing its stories whether you could follow or not. And that humility, that uneasy awareness that the land always got the last word, was what made the next step sacred. Because once you could read the world's sentences, you had to learn how to move with its rhythm. Time wasn't something you wore on your wrist, it was something you walked through. For a hunter, the year wasn't a circle divided by dates. It was a migration drawn in muscle memory. When the wind changed pitch, you knew it was time to move. When the river tasted of meltwater, you knew the fish were waking. Calendars were for people who could afford to stay in one place. Hunters had the kind of schedule written directly into their stomachs. The seasons weren't romantic metaphors. They were contracts. In spring, the plains came alive in a flood of green and hooves. The bison herds rolled northward, dark waves moving across the prairie, and the hunters followed, not out of wanderlust, but debt. The herds fed them, clothed them, built their homes. If the bison left, the people left. If the bison died, the people died. The relationship was practical theology, a faith with blood on its altar and gratitude in its aftertaste. In the subarctic, the rhythm was harsher: ice, thaw, bugs, ice again. The Dean and Cree carried their lives across landscapes that reinvented themselves every few weeks. They built winter lodges in thick woods, followed caribou trails that looked more like hieroglyphs than paths, and dismantled their world every time the snow softened. Migration wasn't adventure. It was the closest thing to routine anyone in those latitudes had. Everything depended on precision. Move too early, and the herds hadn't arrived. Move too late, and they'd already been hunted to exhaustion by someone hungrier. It wasn't greed, it was choreography. Each tribe had its turn, each hunting ground its season. Even rival nations shared an unspoken calendar. A buffalo taken too soon was an insult, not to another tribe, but to the balance itself. Modern people would call it sustainability. Back then, it was just common sense. The plains, of course, demanded speed. Summer hunts meant days of tracking, nights of smoking meat, and mornings spent scraping hides while trying not to fall asleep standing. Women worked as fur processors, meat preservers, and logistical geniuses. Men returned from the hunt, pretending exhaustion while knowing everyone saw through the act. Autumn brought storage, drying racks, pits lined with stone, smokehouses sealed tight against mold and insects. Nothing was wasted except time. By winter, the entire world shrank. Camps clustered near rivers. Hides were stretched into domes. Fires burned low to save wood. Hunters turned from pursuit to protection, guarding the camp from wolves, trading with whoever hadn't frozen, and waiting for the sky to forgive them with spring. This was when children learned patience and when laughter turned dry, brittle, like bark. Humor, after all, was the only renewable resource during starvation. And yet, migration wasn't chaos. It was choreography disguised as struggle. Every route was memorized: watering holes, choke points, sheltering ridges. The Lakota followed the same rivers for centuries. The Anishinaabe paddled through waterways that doubled as maps. To move was to remember. To stop moving was to die in one place and be forgotten in the next. There was, however, a brutal beauty to it, an elegance in how predictable the hardships were. You always knew which month would bring hunger, which moon would bring birth, which week you'd curse the weather for lying. The rhythm was steady, older than any legend, and it carried everyone in its grip. Hunters didn't plan for the future. They simply kept pace with it, because in the end, migration wasn't about chasing animals. It was about staying within reach of meaning: the next hunt, the next meal, the next confirmation that the land still tolerated your existence. And at the center of that relationship stood one animal, heavy, wild, generous, and cursed to sustain entire nations. The buffalo, or bison, if you're feeling technical, was the closest thing the plains had to a god that bled. It wasn't worshipped with temples, but with knives, songs, and gratitude disguised as pragmatism. The animal was so central to life that calling it important is like calling oxygen useful. It was the ecosystem's beating heart, and when it stopped, so did everything else. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, and countless others, the buffalo was both meal plan and metaphor. It was food, fuel, clothing, and architecture, a one-animal civilization. Its meat fed the tribe, its hide became tipis and robes, its sinew turned into bowstrings, its bones became tools. Even the hooves were boiled down to glue. Nothing wasted, nothing ornamental. The phrase "provider of everything" wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was inventory. Hunting one wasn't simple slaughter. It was negotiation, a conversation between hunger and humility. Before a hunt, ceremonies honored the buffalo's spirit. Tobacco was burned, songs were sung, and prayers were whispered to ensure balance. Because to kill without respect was to risk famine. The animal might not forgive arrogance. Plains hunters were deeply practical people, but they understood reciprocity better than most modern economists. You take, you thank. You fail to thank, you suffer. The hunt itself was an act of organized chaos. Before horses arrived, hunters approached herds on foot, camouflaged in hides, creeping close enough to feel the earth shake. They used fire, noise, and precision to drive the herd toward cliffs, the famous buffalo jumps. One scream, one thunderous fall, and the valley became a sacrifice site. The work after was as brutal as the kill: skinning, butchering, hauling, smoking, curing. For every hunter chasing glory, there were 10 more scraping fat and drying hides until their fingers cracked. Civilization smells like blood and smoke before it smells like progress. When horses entered the picture, the entire theater changed. A mounted hunter could match the buffalo's speed, circling the herd with a bow in one hand and balance in the other. Arrows pierced lungs and hearts in seconds. The best marksman could drop several buffalo in a single run. It was beauty and horror braided together. The rhythm of hooves, dust rising like prayer, the rush of triumph, chased by the quiet guilt of killing something magnificent. And yet, nothing went to waste. Hides became tipi covers and shields. Stomachs turned into water bags, tails into whips, dung into fuel. Even the skulls were placed facing east, toward the rising sun, in acknowledgement of what had been given. Waste was not sin in the moral sense, it was stupidity, and stupidity got you starved. The irony, of course, came later, when colonization turned reverence into industry. Railroads, rifles, and markets reduced millions of buffalo to bones bleaching in the sun. What had once been the heartbeat of the plains became a warning that no god survives mass production. Hunters watched the herds vanish and understood before anyone else that a world without buffalo wasn't just emptier, it was senseless. For those who had lived by the animal, its disappearance wasn't economic, it was existential. The buffalo had been proof that balance was possible, that life and death could share a language. When it was gone, that language went silent. And in the silence that followed, the hunter's role began to shift, from provider to guardian, from pursuer to protector. Because when the herds disappeared, there was still something left to defend. The camp, the people, the fragile thread of survival that tied them to everything still breathing. Protection wasn't a title. It was an insomnia that lasted a lifetime. The hunter didn't stop being useful after the kill. When the fires burned low and the wind started whispering in that uneasy way it does before trouble, someone had to stay awake. The protector wasn't a hero, he was the human version of a perimeter alarm. No medals, no applause, just the quiet relief of everyone else being alive in the morning. The camp was fragile in ways outsiders never understood. It wasn't just people and tents, it was an ecosystem pretending to be domesticity. Everything had to work. Fires lit in the right pattern. Storage pits sealed tight. Hides stretched at the correct angle to the wind. Every smell, every sound was potential danger. Wolves could steal meat. Strangers could steal everything else. Among the plains peoples, a single lapse in vigilance could turn a thriving camp into a ghost story. Guards rotated through the night, moving like shadows around the lodges. Some listened to the wind, others to the horses. The animals knew first, they always did. A restless horse meant someone was near, maybe human, maybe worse. The protector's job wasn't to panic, but to read signs and decide which kind of chaos was coming. Coyotes and rival tribes both howled in the dark, but the latter had worse manners. Protection wasn't just defense against enemies, it was insurance against the land itself. Blizzards, flash floods, wildfires, all could kill faster than arrows. In winter, protectors checked snowdrifts for buried fires and sleeping children. In summer, they patrolled for snakes and sudden storms. A good protector was equal parts hunter, strategist, and overworked babysitter. He had to think like danger before danger thought of him. Weapons changed depending on where you lived. In the subarctic, the Dean Guard carried spears and axes because bows were too slow in close range. On the plains, guards relied on bows, later muskets, and eventually horses, fast, silent, nervous as their riders. Horses were as vital to protection as arrows. They could sense threats long before human senses caught up. Some warriors claimed their horses had dreams that warned them of raids. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. The belief kept everyone alive, and raids came often. Rival nations fought over hunting grounds, water, and horses. Protection wasn't about winning, it was about minimizing disaster. A quick response could save the herd or the children. The irony was that most attacks didn't start with war cries. They started with footsteps, soft as moths. A real warrior's victory was to stop an enemy before anyone noticed he was there. Heroism, in this context, meant nobody died before breakfast. Even within the camp, Protection had layers. The elders were guarded first. They held the stories, the instructions for rebuilding if the worst happened. Then came the women and children, not out of chauvinism, but practicality. They were the memory keepers and the future labor force. Hunters were expendable by design. Protection meant knowing you might not be the one being protected. But it wasn't all solemn duty. There was humor even in paranoia. Watchmen teased each other about falling asleep mid-patrol, about mistaking wind for footsteps, about aiming at raccoons they swore were enemies. Fear, like hunger, demanded laughter as digestion. Without it, you broke. And if you broke, the camp broke with you. By dawn, when the sky bruised into gray and the fires died down, the protectors could finally rest for an hour, maybe two. Then came morning tasks, mending tools, checking traps, pretending not to be exhausted. Their reward wasn't glory but continuity. The silence of a sleeping camp wasn't peaceful. It was proof that vigilance still worked. And that silence had another edge: hunger. Because once the camp was safe, the next question was whether there'd be enough food to justify all this guarding. Hunger never stayed quiet for long. It was always next in line. In most places, is an inconvenience. In the old camps, it was a conversation partner, persistent, sarcastic, and far too intimate. It taught discipline faster than any elder could. He didn't complain about it, because everyone was starving, and hunger didn't care about fairness. It was the only democracy that ever worked flawlessly. It punished everyone equally. For a hunter, hunger was both enemy and teacher. It sharpened the senses, stripped away pride, and made even small victories taste divine. The first rule was simple: never trust a full stomach. It made people lazy, careless, and forgetful. Hunters joked that comfort made men deaf, a subtle way of saying that the well-fed stopped listening to the land. Hunger, though cruel, kept you honest. It made you remember the smell of the earth, the pulse in your hands before a shot, the quiet between breaths when life was deciding whether to feed you or not. Winter was the real examiner. When the herds moved south or disappeared into blizzards, when the lakes froze and the traps caught nothing but air, hunger stopped whispering and started screaming. The Cree and Dean boiled bones until they dissolved, scraped hides for the last scraps of fat, and chewed on frozen berries that tasted like dust and regret. On the plains, people burned buffalo dung for fuel and joked that it smelled better than their stomachs felt. Humor, once again, was calorie-free but necessary. Children learned young that hunger wasn't tragedy. It was curriculum. The elders told stories of lean winters when people survived on broth made from leather and gratitude. Every generation had its famine legends, part warning, part manual. The moral was always the same: you are not owed comfort. The land gives and takes, and the only sin is believing it owes you anything at all. Still, hunger made philosophers out of practical men. A hunter might sit by the fire after 3 days without food, staring at the flames as if waiting for an answer. Hunger stripped the world down to its bones. It made you see which parts of life were decoration and which were structure. It taught patience so deep it bordered on prayer. When you hadn't eaten in days, every sound in the forest became suspiciously edible. Snow looked like sugar. Bark began to smell like bread. The mind got creative when the body got desperate. But hunger was also communal. No one starved alone. Food was shared, even when it wasn't enough. Among Plains nations, the best hunters often gave away their first kills, not because they were saints, but because generosity kept balance. If you hoarded, you became the weak link when the next famine hit. Shared hunger made shared survival. You didn't have to like everyone you fed. You just had to want the camp to exist tomorrow. And there was always that silent understanding. Hunger built resilience, but too much of it erased people from history. Some winters didn't end. Some families didn't wake. When explorers later wrote about vanished tribes, they rarely realized they were just describing the math of hunger. How many calories a human body could spare before it disappeared. The hunter, in the end, didn't fear death as much as waste. To die hunting was noble. To die with empty traps was humiliation. And so, even at the edge of collapse, the hunter kept walking, eyes sharp, bow ready, because quitting didn't exist. Hunger might win eventually, it always did, but dignity meant it had to work for the victory. And in that strange, harsh arithmetic of survival, every meal came with memory. The next kill wasn't just food, it was vengeance, gratitude, and redemption in equal measure. And sometimes, when the first bite hit your tongue after days of emptiness, it didn't even taste like meat. It tasted like forgiveness. And forgiveness, that delicate truce between life and death, was exactly what the hunter faced next. When the act of killing itself became ceremony, death was the only companion that never lied. For the hunter, it wasn't some shadowy concept whispered about in temples. It was a constant, physical neighbor. It crouched in the grass beside the prey, followed your footprints home, and occasionally borrowed your reflection in the water just to remind you who really ran the show. You didn't fear it so much as negotiate with it. Every hunt was a conversation that ended with someone not breathing, and the hunter could never be sure who that would be. Killing wasn't romanticized. It was practical, messy, and sometimes shamefully emotional. The animal wasn't game. It was a living system that you just interrupted. When the arrow struck true, when the bison fell, there was no cheering, just the sound of heavy air, the silence that follows impact, and that strange electric moment when life decided to let go. The Lakota, Blackfoot, and Cree all had rituals to honor that moment. Quiet words, a handful of tobacco, sometimes a simple touch to the animal's head. Not apology, not ownership, acknowledgement. Death required manners. The hunter's relationship with death was transactional but sacred. You took flesh, you gave respect. You didn't waste, you didn't brag, and you didn't pretend the act was clean. Hunters understood what modern people like to forget. Life feeds on life, and pretending otherwise is just bad accounting. They knew the hierarchy could flip at any time. The same hunter who took a buffalo today might be taken by a cougar tomorrow. The food chain wasn't a ladder, it was a roulette wheel, and yet, they joked about it. Humor made the unthinkable bearable. Around fires, hunters told stories of those who died trying to hug a bear, or forgot which way the arrow pointed. Death, like cold, lost its sting if you could laugh at it. The best storytellers were usually the ones who'd come closest to not surviving men and women who'd stared into something huge and sharp-toothed and somehow walked back out. Their laughter carried the exact pitch of relief. The physical rituals of death were everywhere. Skulls of buffalo were placed facing east to greet the rising sun, a gesture that said, "Thank you for not trampling me. Let's do this again next season." Hunters wore claws, teeth, or feathers not as trophies but as contracts. Each one said, "I've seen the line between living and not living, and I'm still walking it." Among the Cree, bear hunts were followed by elaborate thank you feasts, where the skull was treated as a guest of honor, because offending a bear spirit was the kind of bad idea that tended to echo. There was an honesty to this kind of spirituality, no promises of eternal bliss, no threats of fire, just a constant reminder that you, too, would feed something someday. The line between the eater and the eaten was only temporary. That understanding bred a kind of humility modern cultures can only simulate through poetry. When you butchered an animal, you weren't just feeding the camp, you were participating in the oldest economy on earth. One measured, not in money, but in mortality. And when the hunter killed too often or too greedily, nature corrected him. Scarcity followed arrogance the way thunder follows lightning. A wasted carcass was an insult with a predictable response. The land remembered, but in that brutal honesty lay a strange comfort. The hunter didn't deny death, he integrated it. Each scar, each close call, each meal was a reminder that living was only temporary ownership of borrowed breath. Death wasn't the end, it was the rent coming due. And perhaps that's why the hunter never looked away. He cleaned what he killed, he faced what he feared, and he carried those lessons home like a quiet contagion. Because the next step after death wasn't grief, it was meaning. And meaning, in the hunter's world, lived in the realm of dreams and prayers, where the spirit of what was taken could still answer back. If death was the hunter's companion, spirit was his supervisor, invisible, humorless, and always watching. Hunting wasn't just a job, it was a theological performance that demanded accuracy in both aim and attitude. You could miss an elk and recover, but offend its spirit, and you might as well hang up your bow for the season. Every animal had an awareness. Every act of taking life had paperwork in the unseen world. You didn't just hunt the animal, you negotiated with its essence. Before the hunt, there were rituals. The Ojibwe burned tobacco, the Lakota fasted, the Cree dreamed. Preparation was as spiritual as it was physical, a way of proving you weren't hunting for vanity. The animal had to agree, in a sense, to give itself. The hunter might have visions, a moose walking into firelight, a bison turning its head and nodding once, an eagle circling low over camp. These weren't metaphors, they were permissions. The line between religion and survival was so thin it was practically translucent. Dreams were the official communication channel of the wild. A hunter who ignored them risked failure or worse. Among the Deen, if a dream animal appeared but wasn't honored in the right way, maybe the offering was skipped, or the first bite wasn't shared, bad luck spread like mold. Traps would stay empty, arrows would miss, the weather would turn spiteful. The world had a sense of humor, but not a forgiving one. When the kill finally came, the ritual resumed. The first cut of meat went to the fire, to the earth, or to the sky. Each tradition had its logic. The act said, "I know this wasn't free," and the animal's spirit, theoretically, appreciated the gesture. Hunters often spoke softly to the carcass, explaining their reasons. The children, the elders, the long winter. You couldn't deceive a spirit, but you could show manners. Nature might be ruthless, but it respected etiquette. Even tools followed the code. Bows and knives were blessed or purified after a successful kill. You didn't brag about your accuracy or your weapon's sharpness. The pride would backfire. A dull knife the next hunt wasn't coincidence, it was cosmic sarcasm. Women who tanned the hides also participated in the code, singing songs to soften the work, treating the skin as something still half alive. Everything connected, from the flint edge to the smoke in the air. Animals, it was said, chose their hunters. The old ones swore a caribou could sense a respectful heart. Disrespect, on the other hand, could be smelled miles away. There's an almost bureaucratic efficiency in that cosmic selection based on moral odor. It kept people honest. And then there were the taboos, quiet laws that needed no enforcement because the consequences enforced themselves. Killing for sport was unthinkable. Killing a pregnant animal brought famine. Laughing at a wounded creature invited a mirror. And if you mocked a spirit animal, a bear, an eagle, a wolf, you were effectively applying for early retirement from existence. The irony is that the system worked. For thousands of years, no species vanished, no land was stripped bare. It wasn't sustainability by design, it was humility in action. The hunters knew that the world had no need for humans, and that survival depended on pretending it did. Every offering, every song, every fast was just another way of saying, "We know our place." And yet, that place came with weight. The hunter's success determined the camp's survival, but his failure was blamed on unseen forces, bad spirits, angry ancestors, or simply a lapse in respect. The invisible was never really invisible. It was just waiting for someone to mess up. So the hunter prayed, fasted, and listened. He lived in the tension between need and reverence, killing and thanking, existing and apologizing. And that balance, that strange, exhausting diplomacy with the natural world, extended far beyond the hunt, into the camp, the family, the small and fragile society that the hunter's skill was sworn to protect. Behind every heroic hunting tale was someone elbowed deep in buffalo fat, wondering when the men would stop bragging and start helping. The romantic image of the lone hunter only made sense if you ignored who kept him alive afterward. Family wasn't sentimental, it was the supply chain. A kill meant nothing until it was processed, stored, and distributed. And that was women's domain, the quiet industry that turned blood and bone into civilization. In every nation from the Lakota to the Anishinaabe, survival was a collective art form disguised as domestic routine. When the hunters returned, exhausted and half-frozen, the camp came alive. Women moved fast, cutting, scraping, tanning, boiling, drying, converting chaos into order before the meat spoiled. A successful hunt didn't end with the arrow. It ended when the last strip of flesh was drying in the sun. The irony is that the men got the glory songs, but the women did the chemistry. Processing a buffalo wasn't delicate work. It was strength, rhythm, and timing. Skins were scraped clean with stone or metal tools until hands blistered. Sinew was twisted into thread for sewing or bowstrings. Bones were split for marrow. Children helped too, learning early that chores weren't optional and that playtime could wait until the next migration. In most camps, every person had a function from the moment they could hold something without dropping it. The community didn't raise freeloaders. And then there was the moral economy, the unwritten rule that generosity was more valuable than possession. The hunter who returned with the biggest kill was often expected to give away most of it. Hoarding was social suicide. Among the Plains tribes, meat and hides were distributed to widows, elders, or families who'd lost someone. It wasn't altruism, it was logistics. The tribe only worked if everyone did. A starving neighbor was a future burden. Better to feed them now than bury them later. Marriage was less about romance and more about survival strategy. A skilled tanner or seamstress was as desirable as a good hunter, maybe more so, since her work actually lasted. Affection existed, of course, but practicality ran the household. A woman could make or break a hunter's reputation. A well-tanned hide meant competence. A poorly smoked one meant gossip. The line between personal pride and public humiliation was about 0.5 millimeter of hide thickness. Even child rearing was communal. Babies were carried in cradleboards while mothers worked, wrapped tight and quiet as bundles of future labor. Affection came through presence, not pampering. Parents didn't need to say "I love you." They demonstrated it by making sure the child survived winter. The village's warmth was measured not in emotion, but in calories and cooperation. Still, humor found its way into everything. Women teased the men about their great bravery for chasing animals that didn't shoot back. Men teased the women about being scarier than any bear. It was affection disguised as sarcasm, a psychological necessity when every day could end in disaster. Laughter kept the edge off the work. Without it, the camp would have drowned in exhaustion. And while men were the nominal protectors, women were the ones who ensured continuity. When famine hit, they rationed food with mathematical ruthlessness. When illness spread, they knew which plants to crush, which roots to boil, which prayers to whisper. Power wasn't centralized. It was distributed in calloused hands and stubborn intelligence. The protector might guard the camp from threats, but the women guarded its future from collapse. They were the unacknowledged architects of stability, the engineers of endurance. A hunter could vanish on the plains, and life went on, because the camp's real machinery never stopped working. And yet, even with this delicate balance, danger was never fully domestic. Beyond the ring of tents or lodges, the world kept reminding them that no family, no camp, no peace lasted without defense. The same hands that built and fed could also pick up weapons, because in a world made of scarcity and envy, someone was always watching your herd, your river, your land, and thinking, maybe it should be ours. War, for the hunter, wasn't a separate profession, it was an unpleasant sequel to hunting. The same skills that kept people fed also kept them alive when someone else decided your buffalo looked delicious. Territorial conflict wasn't about ideology. It was about calories and horses. Plains nations like the Lakota, Comanche, and Crow didn't fight for conquest, but for resources, revenge, and reputation, the holy trinity of necessity. To an outsider, raids looked chaotic. To the people involved, they were choreography with sharper stakes. A good warrior moved like a shadow, struck fast, and left before dawn remembered him. War wasn't about slaughter. It was about control of herds, water, or the right to move freely through hunting lands. When you lived in an ecosystem with limited generosity, territory was survival spelled in blood. And yet, the hunter's philosophy never fully disappeared from the battlefield. War followed rules, even when they were inconvenient. Among many plains tribes, warriors earned prestige not for killing but for counting coup, getting close enough to touch an enemy and live to mock him about it later. It was bravery as performance art, heroism with built-in restraint. Killing was efficient, touching was impressive. One fed your ego, the other fed your legend. Weapons barely changed, bows, lances, tomahawks, only the targets did. When firearms arrived, they were both blessing and curse. Muskets gave advantage, but they also made war louder, shorter, and less honorable. The man who once needed patience and precision could now pull a trigger and let the powder do the work. Some called it progress, others called it noise pollution. Territorial defense wasn't endless chaos. There were truces, alliances, and marriages that turned bloodlines into border treaties. The Blackfoot and Gros Ventre had complex agreements over grazing lands. The Cheyenne and Arapaho shared hunting routes. Even old enemies occasionally paused for trade, hides, meat, tobacco, or the rare peace pipe. But trust was temporary. Every alliance had an expiration date printed in invisible ink. A protector's duty didn't end when the battle stopped. He scouted borders, counted horses, watched smoke on the horizon. Paranoia wasn't pathology, it was foresight. A single unattended herd could invite opportunistic visitors. Opportunity, in this context, usually meant raiding party. The art of protection was knowing when caution turned into cowardice and when courage turned into stupidity. Warfare, for all its ugliness, also built identity. The songs, dances, and ornaments that later anthropologists described so poetically were often the aftershocks of survival. Feathers, scars, painted faces, each carried a story not of glory but of endurance. Every mark said, "I came back when others didn't." It was never just decoration, it was memory, worn publicly because silence could only hold so much. Women fought too, when the line broke or the odds demanded it. Some became legends: Buffalo Calf Roadwoman, Running Eagle, others whose names were never written down. They picked up weapons for the same reason they picked up knives to butcher. Someone had to, and the gods were busy. Gender didn't exempt you from danger, it only changed your title. And through it all, there was an understanding that war wasn't destiny, it was failure of balance. A tribe that fought too often risked depletion, famine, and spiritual imbalance. Even victory came with consequences: grief, disease, the weight of dead names. After battle, warriors underwent purification rituals, not celebration. You washed away not just blood, but memory. For centuries, this brutal equilibrium held. Territory shifted, hands changed, life continued. But then came new arrivals, pale, polite, and armed with paperwork, who claimed to represent civilization, but mostly represented hunger with better marketing. And that's when protection stopped being seasonal and became permanent, when defending land turned into defending existence itself. It's remarkable how fast balance collapses once someone invents profit. The arrival of Europeans didn't announce itself with fanfare or divine light, just the smell of wet wool, gunpowder, and entitlement. They came speaking in treaties and trade, two words that meant the same thing in practice. Take as much as you can before the other side understands the terms. The hunter's world, once calibrated to migration and reciprocity, found itself reprogrammed by markets that didn't know how to say enough. At first, the encounters seemed manageable. Metal knives stayed sharp longer. Muskets dropped animals at twice the distance. Beads, kettles, blankets, miracles of convenience. And then came alcohol, which did what muskets never could. It made people forget who they were. The fur trade transformed the hunter from a provider into a middleman, chasing pelts not for survival but for credit. Trapping replaced hunting. The sacred relationship with the land turned transactional. Where meat once meant life, now beaver skins meant rifles, and rifles meant debt. Buffalo, the old god, was the first casualty. By the mid-19th century, herds that had thundered across the plains for millennia were reduced to ghost lines on the horizon. Hunters who once killed to eat, now killed to sell. And then when colonists industrialized the slaughter, killed nothing at all because there was nothing left. The land fell silent. Bones littered the prairie like punctuation marks in a story abruptly cut off. The protector's role, once so clear, dissolved into confusion. Protect what? Hunt where? Feed whom? And then came the borders, invisible lines drawn on maps by men who'd never ridden across those distances. Whole nations found themselves told they were trespassing on their own hunting grounds. Treaties promised land for as long as the rivers flow, which turned out to be about 6 months, give or take. Every signature cost a horizon. The hunter who had once measured wealth in knowledge now had to measure it in acres he didn't own. Colonial disruption wasn't just physical, it was psychological vandalism. Missionaries translated sin into languages that had never needed the concept. Children were taught to pray to a god who disapproved of almost everything that had kept their ancestors alive. Boarding schools cut hair, renamed children, and called it progress. Spiritual codes of the hunt were replaced by catechisms about obedience. It was the most efficient erasure in history. Destroy meaning, then sell the replacement. Even the protectors were disarmed. Literally. Horses were seized, rifles restricted, warriors labeled hostile for defending what had been theirs since memory began. The plains became fenced, the forests logged, the rivers dammed. And through it all, the hunter watched. The man who had once tracked herds across open country, now confined to reservations, told to farmland that no longer spoke his language. You can't grow corn in grief, but they tried anyway. Yet even in ruin, fragments survived. Stories carried in whispers, rituals disguised as chores. A tobacco offering before fishing, a small prayer before skinning. Gestures that outlived policy. Colonization succeeded in rearranging the world, but not in silencing it completely. The old rhythms hid themselves in lullabies and kitchen smoke. The irony, of course, is that the colonizers came chasing abundance and created scarcity instead, a perfect inversion of the hunter's code. Where once everything had been taken with gratitude, now everything was taken with invoices. And the protector, stripped of his territory, became a witness, watching the collapse of his own ecosystem. The silence of vanished hooves, the sound of wind where once there had been life. But stories don't die as easily as herds. They linger. They turn into reminders, lessons, and sometimes vengeance. Because even when the buffalo bones had been ground into fertilizer, something else remained memory. And that memory still had work to do, because the people who carried it weren't extinct. They adapted, endured, and kept the knowledge breathing. And with that endurance came the last inheritance of the hunter. Not the weapons, not the land, but the responsibility to remember what it all once meant. History likes to pretend the story ended, that the hunter disappeared into sepia photographs and museum dioramas. One more vanished culture filed between the mastodon and the telegraph. But anyone who's ever stood in the wind on a prairie, or watched snow swallow a trail in the north, knows the story isn't over. The hunter didn't vanish. He adapted. He became something quieter, harder to catalogue, a lineage carried in memory, in gesture, in the way some people still look at the land like it's an old friend they owe money to. The legacy of the native hunter isn't nostalgia, it's endurance. It's still there, in the rhythm of ceremonial hunts, in the laws that demand you thank the animal, in the songs sung softly over first kills. Among the Lakota, Ojibwe, Cree, Blackfoot, and countless others, hunting is still not sport, it's continuity, a connection older than nations, older than borders. Even today, elders teach young hunters how to walk into the woods properly, quietly, humbly, with an awareness that you're entering someone else's living room. The irony is that modernity keeps trying to rediscover what never went missing. Environmentalists speak of balance and sustainability as if they invented the concepts, while indigenous knowledge holders have been living them since before balance had a PR department. Hunters didn't study ecology, they embodied it. Every arrow shot, every prayer whispered into the smoke, was data in a spiritual algorithm that kept the world from collapsing under its own appetite. And still, the memory of loss hangs everywhere. The buffalo returned, but as conservation projects fenced in by irony, the great migrations no longer rumble through the plains. They exist in documentaries and tribal art, like ghosts translated into pixels. But the people remain. They dance for the herds that used to cover the horizon. They tell the stories of hunger, of courage, of laughter beside the fire. They make sure their children know that to take life without gratitude is to forget who you are. In the north, Cree trappers still leave tobacco where an animal dies. Along the rivers, Ojibwe hunters still speak to the water before they fish. It isn't superstition, it's etiquette. The kind the modern world, with all its noise and convenience, forgot how to practice. Every offering, every story told in winter lodges, is a refusal to let amnesia finish what colonization started. Memory is its own form of protection. The protector's role didn't end with the last hunt. It shifted inward. Now it's about safeguarding language, land, ceremony, the invisible architecture of identity. The hunter who once stood guard over sleeping camps now stands guard over stories, making sure they're not lost to translation or neglect. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, the understanding that survival was never just about food or shelter. It was about respect, the idea that you share the world, not own it. That you're one heartbeat among billions, lucky enough to borrow space for a while. The old hunters knew that. They lived it every time they drew a bow, every time they thanked an animal, every time they walked home under a sky that didn't owe them anything. Their descendants still carry that knowledge, sometimes in ceremony, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter so dry it could crack stone. Because in the end, the hunter's story was never about death or conquest or loss. It was about remembering that the land has a memory longer than ours, and that it's still listening. Every society draws a line between safety and wilderness. But for nomadic peoples, that line wasn't inked on maps, it flickered in firelight. The camp was the only architecture that mattered. Inside, things had names, faces, and stories. Outside, everything was anonymous, teeth-shaped, and possibly hungry. The boundary wasn't physical so much as psychological. A few meters of smoke, warmth, and conversation holding back a continent of uncertainty. Anthropologists call it the circle of safety, though it was really more of a fragile bubble inflated each night by vigilance and luck. Inside that bubble, people laughed, cooked, repaired things, fell asleep. Outside, things listened. The distance between the two was sometimes less than the reach of a torch. One careless step, and you stopped being part of a community and became part of the food chain. Fire was the unofficial perimeter marker. It wasn't just warmth, it was control, light, smell. Predators didn't fear humans, they feared unpredictability, and fire was chaos made visible. Archaeological sites show repeated patterns, circular hearths surrounded by debris, sleeping areas radiating outward like petals around a nervous flower. The design wasn't aesthetic, it was strategy. Light in the center, darkness at the edges, everything beyond the flicker, a kind of slow-motion threat. Even the smell of smoke had purpose. It clung to hides, hair, and weapons, masking the scent of blood that might attract unwanted guests. The campfire was both deodorant and declaration. This space is taken. Among hunter-gatherer groups across continents, the San, the Hadza, the Inuit, the Plains peoples, the structure of the camp evolved less for comfort than for defense. The circle was survival geometry. Inside that circle, hierarchy softened. Children were free to move. Elders told stories that doubled as warning manuals. Each tale, whether it mentioned a bear, a ghost, or a shapeshifter, was a topographical guide disguised as bedtime entertainment. The creatures outside weren't invented to scare. They were invented to remind. The moment the story stopped being funny, you realized it was also a set of instructions. There were practical rules, too. Never leave the fire alone. Never step outside after dark, unless you want your name turned into a cautionary proverb. Never whistle past the camp's edge. It was said to invite something to answer. Across cultures, the same instincts appeared under different mythologies. Don't provoke the dark. Don't test your luck, and for the love of whatever gods you believe in, don't assume silence means safety. The camp's perimeter also held meaning beyond fear. It was the social membrane, the space where intimacy met cooperation. Inside, people argued, flirted, carved tools, and cooked. Outside, they hunted, prayed, disappeared. Crossing that line meant changing roles, from nurturer to negotiator, from human to potential prey. It was both literal and symbolic. The way a doorframe marks the difference between domestic warmth and the wind that wants to kill you. Sometimes, that line moved. Nomadic life meant the camp was temporary, built, defended, dismantled. Safety was portable, carried in memory and ritual rather than stone and wall. The skills that built fire circles became the first architecture, the prototype of civilization. What came later, fences, cities, borders, were just exaggerated versions of that first flickering edge of control. Civilization, when stripped of marble and politics, is really just a bigger campfire. And yet, no matter how large the circle grew, the rules stayed the same. Everything beyond it wanted something from you. Food, flesh, or foolishness. The wilderness didn't discriminate, it only waited. And in that waiting darkness, one could sometimes hear movement, the low shuffle of fur, the break of twigs, the small, deliberate noises that reminded everyone why the camp existed at all. Every ecosystem had its accountants, the creatures that made sure nothing ate for free. Long before human arrogance built walls, the night handled its own border control. Step beyond the light, and something out there was already measuring your confidence. Predators were the original auditors. They didn't hate you, they simply balanced the books. On the plains, wolves did the calculations. In the forests, it was cougars, bears, or the occasional opportunistic human. To the Arctic people, polar bears were less animal and more divine bureaucracy, agents of consequence patrolling the snow. They appeared without warning, pale as the landscape itself, enormous and almost polite in their inevitability. Everything in the north is hungry, an old Dean saying goes, and some of it walks upright. Even smaller predators contributed to the educational system. Insects bit, snakes hid, and the occasional raccoon reminded you that curiosity had nutritional value. The wilderness didn't waste lessons. Every bite came with a moral. Anthropologists like to talk about predator-prey dynamics, but in simpler terms, it was just the universe reminding people to pay attention. Camps were designed to anticipate those nightly negotiations. Archaeological digs in the Great Basin and across the Eurasian steppe show defensive geometry, fire pits surrounded by rings of discarded bones and stones, serving both as barrier and psychological comfort. The bones told stories. This is what happens to the things that came too close. Early deterrence marketing. You could say the sentinels who kept watch at night learned that sound was more trustworthy than sight. Vision ended at the fire's edge, but hearing stretched into the dark. A cough, a shuffle, a change in the rhythm of wind through grass. The difference between safety and death was sometimes one misplaced heartbeat. In some Arctic camps, guards tied strings to small bones or shells, creating improvised alarm systems that rattled when something stepped where it shouldn't. It wasn't superstition. It was low-tech surveillance. Predators, of course, didn't always come on for legs. In the Amazon, the Tupi and Yanomami spoke of curupira and jungle spirits that lured hunters astray. On the North American plains, similar warnings took the shape of skinwalkers or wandering souls, cautionary tales wrapped in fur and folklore. They functioned less as ghost stories and more as early risk assessments. Don't wander off is easier to remember when the alternative is being kidnapped by something mythologically grotesque. The unsettling truth was that predators had perfect timing. They came when humans relaxed, when bellies were full, when stories got funny, when firelight lulled the body into thinking it was invincible. The night didn't care for laughter. It waited for it to fade. But what makes the whole thing fascinating isn't just biology, it's psychology. Across continents, humans started modeling predator behavior. Hunters watched wolves to learn cooperation. They studied lions for timing, bears for tenacity. The enemy became the teacher. Predators, by forcing attention, indirectly invented strategy. You could almost call them reluctant mentors, the kind that teach through trauma. And sometimes, the most dangerous predators were other humans pretending they weren't. The line between visitor and threat was thin, often invisible, and it was human territory, not wilderness, that proved hardest to predict. For all the stories about wolves and spirits, most people died at the hands of someone who looked uncomfortably familiar. The wilderness had its rules, cruel but consistent. Humans, on the other hand, were chaos with a heartbeat. The real predators walked on two legs and invented excuses afterward. Every landscape had its invisible borders. The plains, the tundra, the forest, they weren't divided by fences, but by memory. A ridge where your ancestors hunted, a river where someone's cousin was killed, a grove that belonged to no one and therefore belonged to everyone, the most dangerous kind of place. These weren't territories in the colonial sense. They were ecosystems of permission. Step wrong, and it wasn't a violation of property. It was a violation of respect. Ethnographies who studied plains warfare noticed something strange. Tribes that shared trade routes still treated their boundaries like nervous systems. Touch the wrong part, and you got an immediate reaction. Not always fatal, but rarely friendly. The Comanche, Crow, and Lakota, for instance, all knew where their hunting zones overlapped, and that knowledge didn't stop them from colliding. Border conflict wasn't a modern invention. It was a natural side effect of scarcity and pride. To cross uninvited into another group's range meant stepping into history you didn't fully understand. Every hill might hold bones, every valley an unresolved grudge. It wasn't always about resources. Sometimes it was about revenge, honor, or proving you were still dangerous enough to be respected. The anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard once described this kind of violence among the Nuer as organized hostility. It sounds bureaucratic, but it fits. Even killing had paperwork. Raiding parties became both defense and diplomacy. Horses stolen, goods taken, hostages exchanged. The violence had rhythm. Plains warfare, in particular, was ritualized. The aim wasn't always annihilation but demonstration. Count coup, steal horses, prove courage, go home. But the danger was real. Every step outside the camp might put you on someone else's stage, performing survival for an audience that didn't clap. The unspoken rule was simple. Always assume someone's watching. Hunters moved through other people's territories, like thieves in sacred libraries, touching nothing, leaving no trace. The art of invisibility wasn't about stealth. It was about courtesy. To be unseen was the highest form of respect. Those who failed to grasp that concept tended to vanish for good. Even trade, that supposedly peaceful act, could turn murderous if handled without ceremony. On the northern plains, trading posts became temporary truces, not friendships. One wrong tone, one careless glance at the wrong woman, and an exchange of goods turned into an exchange of arrows. Archaeologists find these stories etched in layers of burnt soil and scattered musket balls, the material record of misunderstandings. And so, the world outside the campfire wasn't just filled with teeth and claws. It was filled with politics. Every horizon carried someone else's law. Every path was an act of negotiation. Survival required both courage and etiquette, two qualities rarely found in the same person for long. That's why, before stepping out, people performed small rituals, gestures of humility in case diplomacy failed. A bit of ash on the face, a word to the ancestors, a quiet reminder that you were leaving civilization's last flicker behind. And even then, danger didn't just wait in ambush. Sometimes it was built directly into the ground, the cliffs, the rivers, the ice that cracked underfoot. The land itself was an accomplice. The earth, for all its beauty, has a fairly consistent personality, indifferent and occasionally homicidal. People like to imagine danger as something that growls, but in most of human history, it's the landscape that's done the killing. The land didn't need motives, it only needed timing. Every environment developed its own methods of disposal. In the north, the ice waited patiently, a slow, silent trapdoor. One wrong step on a frozen river, and you weren't a victim of misfortune, you were a lesson. The Inuit had a proverb: the land is kind until it remembers you exist. They built their camps on instinct: snow that wouldn't collapse, wind that wouldn't smother fires, ice that didn't whisper underneath. The margin for error was measured in heartbeats. On the plains, death came with deceptive clarity. Flat horizons tricked the mind into confidence. People walked toward mirages, chasing phantom water until thirst carved their names into the air. Plains hunters knew better than to trust the sun. It exaggerated distance, made safety look close when it wasn't. Dying of exposure wasn't dramatic. It was bureaucratic. The body simply stopped cooperating, and the prairie didn't even pause to notice. In the forests, the problem was visibility. Everything was green, damp, and plotting. The Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and other woodland nations understood that the forest didn't kill with spectacle. It killed with patience. A fall from a wet log, a branch puncture that turned septic, a river current pretending to be gentle, all quiet assassinations. The earth didn't roar, it sighed. Deserts, meanwhile, were the poets of death. They didn't conceal their intentions. They announced them in heat. Every mirage a hallucinated promise, every dune a whisper that said, keep walking. The San and Bedouin learned to move at night, mapping stars instead of roads, because the land itself was an accomplice to exhaustion. Bones vanish fast when the sand approves. The concept of hostile environment sounds modern, but it's older than language. People survived not because they conquered nature, but because they learned its moods. Early camps were positioned according to wind, sun, and flood memory. Geological gossip passed through generations. Ethnographic records from almost every nomadic culture show this pattern: survival through humility. The landscape tolerated humans the way a cat tolerates furniture, until it decided to rearrange things, and the danger wasn't always physical. Some lands carried reputations that made even the bold hesitate. Canyons where sound behaved wrong, forests where no birds sang, tundras that swallowed tracks faster than snow could fall. Anthropology calls these landscape taboos, practical warnings wrapped in supernatural packaging. If a place had a story, it probably had a body count. Even today, people underestimate how intelligent ancient navigation had to be. Without GPS, maps, or rescue, every journey was a calculated risk. A few steps too far from camp and you weren't lost, you were reabsorbed. Nature doesn't kill in anger, it kills by default. And yet, humans kept leaving the circle. Curiosity, hunger, necessity, pick your reason. Each one ended the same way. A lone figure moving into vastness, testing the contract between life and landscape. Some returned with stories, others became stories. And in the dark, just past where the firelight fades, the imagination started to invent company. Not animals this time, but presences, shapes that didn't breathe, eyes that didn't blink. The world outside wasn't empty, it was crowded with the unseen. People didn't invent spirits because they were bored. They invented them because sometimes the wind stared back. When the wilderness pressed too close, when silence grew so heavy it felt like breath on the neck, Imagination stepped in to make sense of it. The unseen wasn't decoration for their worldview. It was the operating system. Every culture developed a way of naming the things that lurked just beyond the campfire's reach. Among Arctic hunters, there were Torngai spirit beings who lived in the corners of storms. In the forests, whispers became ghosts of ancestors or tricksters, testing human arrogance. Plains stories spoke of figures who appeared at the edge of vision and disappeared when confronted. But the logic didn't. If you couldn't predict the danger, you might as well personify it. Fear works better when it has a face. These spirits weren't abstract theology. They were field guides, the supernatural version of Don't Go There. The child who ignored their grandmother's warning about the hill where the wind moaned usually became the next example. Superstition was a safety manual written in metaphor. Ethnographies tend to file these stories under myth, which is academic shorthand for we don't want to admit they were right. Omens were another form of conversation. The world, it was believed, constantly commented on your behavior. Birds calling in odd patterns, fire crackling too loud, sudden silence where there shouldn't be any. These weren't coincidences. They were footnotes from the universe. Plains hunters read them before leaving for hunts. A wolf's howl in the wrong direction could cancel an expedition faster than bad weather. Arctic shamans interpreted auroras as spirits traveling between worlds. To whistle at them was considered suicidal flirtation. The unseen wasn't always hostile. Sometimes it was simply watching ancestral presences, ensuring that rules were followed. Among the Ojibwe and Cree, hunters spoke softly to trees before taking branches for boughs, asking permission. The conversation wasn't symbolic. It was contract law. Break it, and you risked more than guilt. You risked scarcity. Spiritual etiquette was just ecological intelligence in ceremonial clothing. Every culture near wilderness had its nocturnal bureaucracy, spirits for rivers, mountains, storms, and misfortunes. They were as organized as any government, but with better job satisfaction. If the land was moody, these beings were the moods given voice. They explained why the hunt failed, why someone fell ill, why the night suddenly smelled like copper. Blaming the unseen wasn't denial. It was maintaining cosmic order. Humans needed reasons, and the universe provided plenty. The fire served as a diplomatic barrier, a negotiation zone between the living and everything else. Smoke carried messages. Offerings soothed grievances. The line between prayer and pest control was blurry. Tossing tobacco into the flames or food into the water wasn't superstition, it was diplomacy. But the scariest part wasn't that the spirits might appear, it was that they might not. Silence after a ritual meant disapproval. No dream visitation, no animal sign, no whisper of wind. That was the spiritual equivalent of a bureaucratic delay. And in those moments, even the bravest hunters hesitated before stepping past the circle's glow. Because once you crossed that boundary, the unseen world stopped being metaphor and became landscape. And the moment your footprints left the last patch of firelight, you weren't just being watched, you were being read. And from that point on, every movement became a form of communication. You were no longer just walking through the wild, you were part of its grammar. To move through the wild was to write, and the ground was always reading. Tracking wasn't a skill, it was a literacy. Every broken twig, every print in mud, every displaced pebble was a syllable in an ongoing conversation between the living and the hungry. The hunter read these signs to survive. The predator read them for the same reason. The only difference was who finished the sentence. Among plains hunters, tracking was taught as early as walking. Children learned to identify the weight of a hoof by the depth of its mark, the freshness of dung by the color of flies around it. Arctic peoples read snow the way others read books. Wind direction, temperature, and even time of day encoded in its texture. A good tracker could reconstruct an animal's last few hours, like a crime scene investigator with better manners. But there was a rule: if you can read tracks, you can be read. Every step betrayed information: weight, fatigue, intention. Experienced hunters altered their gait to mislead whoever might be behind them. A shorter stride suggested injury. A wider one implied panic. Both could invite pursuit. The best hunters left trails that ended nowhere, a vanishing grammar of survival. Ethnographies studying the San people in southern Africa once called their tracking science with a pulse. They weren't wrong, but this wasn't limited to deserts. Across continents, indigenous trackers shared a common understanding. Observation wasn't passive, it was moral. To read the land without respect risked confusing cause and consequence. You might start thinking you were smarter than what you followed, and that, historically, was the last mistake anyone made. Predators read just as well. Wolves followed not just scent but pattern, the rhythm of footsteps, the confidence in turns. Cougars and bears noticed hesitation. The moment you doubted your path, the world did too. Fear left its own trail: sweat, breath, indecision. Anthropology rarely mentions this, but to live among apex predators meant developing psychological camouflage. Calmness wasn't stoicism, it was armor. Even between humans, tracking could become warfare. Scouts learned to recognize the prints of rival bands, the shape of moccasins, the spacing of steps, the telltale drag of a bow or spear. Footprints were gossip carved into dirt. A careless traveler could reveal not just where they were but who they were. Tribe, age, confidence level. Every path was a confession. Night travel turned the skill into something supernatural. Hunters relied on touch and intuition, mapping terrain through temperature changes underfoot or the way air moved through grass. Some described it as feeling the animal's memory lingering in the soil. Scientists might call that projection. The old hunters called it attention. The difference, of course, is that the latter survived more often. Tracking wasn't only a tool for hunting, it was also for understanding absence. The trail of a missing person, the signs of a fight, the sudden stillness of birds. Each detail formed part of a larger pattern that told a story about what the land had taken. Knowledge wasn't power, it was accountability. You didn't just live in the world, you were continually being evaluated by it. And while the hunter read the earth read him back. Sometimes it wrote in return: a sudden gust, a broken branch, a silence so sharp it erased thought. That was the moment everyone dreaded, when the conversation flipped, and you realized you were no longer the observer. Because in a landscape that remembers everything, the act of walking away doesn't guarantee you've left. And sometimes, what follows doesn't need footprints at all. If predators and spirits had mercy, the weather did not. It was the original equalizer, killing the brave, the foolish, and the cautious with identical efficiency. You could prepare for hunger, you could even outwit a stalking wolf, but you couldn't negotiate with air. The sky never cared for diplomacy. Across the Arctic, a clear morning could turn fatal before lunch. One moment there was visibility, the next, nothing but white. Wind erased tracks faster than thought, and the world collapsed into sound, the low hum of death disguised as weather. The Inuit had 50 words for snow, and none of them meant safety. Hunters tied ropes between sleds and shelters, not out of superstition, but to avoid becoming headlines for future archaeologists. Every rope was a philosophy: don't trust horizons. On the plains, it wasn't the cold but its opposite. The sun could kill as quietly as ice. Nomadic tribes who knew every water source by heart also knew that knowing wasn't enough. Rivers dried, springs vanished, mirages lied. Men walked toward reflections that weren't there, tongues swelling like fruit. Death by thirst was an educational experience, the kind that came with no certificate. The rainforest offered the same cruelty in reverse. Too much water, too much life, too much everything. The humidity ate skin, insects colonized flesh, and the air itself felt carnivorous. Hunters wrapped their feet in leaves, rotated shoes, smeared mud to prevent infection. Small acts of rebellion against an ecosystem that saw them as compost in waiting. Ethnographies later called this adaptive ingenuity, as if survival were a hobby. Hunger, meanwhile, was democracy in its purest form. It humbled everyone. When hunts failed, there were no atheists, only foragers. Roots, bark, insects, all became gourmet if you waited long enough. Among the northern tribes, famine brought rituals of apology to the spirits of the land, as though scarcity were personal punishment. In a way, it was the environment never punished greed gently. Bad timing could turn competence into comedy. Step onto thin ice at dusk, and you'd be remembered as the one who didn't listen. Start a journey with the wrong moon, and you'd offend something ancient enough to make sure you didn't finish it. Many traditional calendars weren't about agriculture. They were manuals of avoidance. When to travel, when to stay still, when the animals were restless, when the wind lied. The people who survived longest weren't the strongest. They were the best at staying bored when boredom was safer. Weather also shaped personality. Constant threat from the elements created stoicism that wasn't philosophical, just practical. You didn't dramatize suffering. You endured it because there wasn't an audience. Hunters who froze to death weren't tragic. They were reminders. The land didn't produce poets, it produced people who didn't need to talk about it. But the real cruelty of weather was its unpredictability. You could interpret clouds, read wind, or count migrating birds, and still die 5 steps outside camp because the gods were having an off day. That uncertainty bred superstition, prayer, and ritual. When the environment can murder you without warning, belief becomes the cheapest insurance policy. And so hunger, exhaustion, and weather formed a trinity more efficient than any predator. But what they really killed first wasn't the body, it was confidence. The knowledge that safety was an illusion gnawed from the inside out, which is probably why people began to invent rituals before leaving the circle, not out of faith, but out of the need to feel like someone, somewhere, was keeping score. And when fear became constant, it stopped feeling like fear at all. It became instinct, the quiet intelligence that said, "Don't go there, not today." Fear wasn't just an emotion out there, it was infrastructure. The invisible system keeping everything running smoothly, like the world's most neurotic power grid. Every culture that lived close to the edge of survival eventually learned that fear was smarter than courage. Courage got you songs. Fear kept you alive long enough to hear them. Anthropologists sometimes call it risk awareness, which is a polite way of saying people learned to panic efficiently. Fear wasn't shameful. It was social glue. The fear of predators, of starvation, of spirits, all of it tuned the group to the same frequency. One person startled, everyone listened. Collective anxiety doubled as early warning radar. In the Arctic, silence itself was a form of communication. If nobody was talking, it meant everyone had heard something. Night intensified it. Darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was imagination made visible. The mind projected shapes where there were none, footsteps where there was wind. Cognitive scientists would later describe it as pattern recognition bias. The old hunters had a simpler explanation: the dark lies. And since no one was volunteering to fact-check it, the rule held. Children were trained early to manage fear like a tool. Among the Dean and the Plains nations, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was emotional conditioning. The tale of the child who ignored warnings and vanished into the forest wasn't meant to traumatize, it was an early survival seminar. Fear was inherited like language. It shaped behavior faster than education ever could. Too little fear was considered a personality defect. Overconfidence got you eaten, or worse, got someone else killed trying to save you. Fear was a collective responsibility. One fool could ruin the ecosystem. A good hunter wasn't fearless, he was fluent in anxiety. He could distinguish between rational danger and the kind that existed only in thought, though the line between the two often shifted depending on hunger and weather. There was also the social performance of bravery, the pretense of calm that held panic in check. Among warriors and hunters alike, showing fear wasn't weakness. Showing too much calm was suspicious. Anyone who didn't flinch at the growl of a bear or the snap of a branch was clearly detached from reality and therefore unreliable. The healthiest fear was the kind you could laugh about later, preferably around a fire with proof of survival nearby. Even laughter had its psychological purpose. Joking about danger was like negotiating with it. A group that could make humor out of terror was a group still in control. In the Arctic, hunters teased each other about frostbite and hunger, the way modern people complain about rent. It didn't solve anything, but it helped metabolize the absurdity of existing in a world trying to kill you. Fear also kept memory alive. Every path not taken, every forbidden hill or cursed cave, carried a story. Generations learned where not to step because someone, somewhere, had stepped there once. Oral tradition was a cartography of caution, maps drawn in emotion instead of ink. And when fear finally went quiet, when hunters grew too used to the dark, too familiar with danger, that's when accidents happened. Familiarity breeds complacency, and complacency is just fear that stopped showing up for work. So people found ways to reawaken it deliberately. Small rituals, whispered prayers, charms tied to belts. Not because they believed the talismans held power, but because they kept humility alive. Fear, properly managed, was reverence, an ongoing apology to existence. And as people began to formalize those feelings, to turn instinct into ceremony, they gave fear its proper costume, ritual. The exit from safety became a sacred act, a miniature theater of mortality, performed at the edge of firelight. Leaving the camp was never casual. It wasn't a stroll. It was a contract. Every departure, even for a short hunt, even to fetch water, was treated as a small death. Because, statistically, it might be, the moment you stepped past the last ring of warmth, you were negotiating with a world that didn't recognize you as special. Rituals, therefore, weren't superstition. They were bureaucracy for the soul. Among the plains hunters, a man might touch the earth before setting out, pressing his palm flat to remind it of their agreement. I walk lightly. You let me come back. The Inuit whispered to the wind before leaving on hunts, acknowledging its role as both guide and executioner. The Innu of Hokkaido bowed to the bear spirit before tracking it, the same way a duelist might salute before trying to kill his opponent. Courtesy never hurt the odds. These gestures seemed poetic until you realized they were also practical. Ritual structured focus. It made a man pause, breathe, remember the dangers. You didn't rush into a blizzard or a forest without first aligning your mind. That pause, that heartbeat of reverence, was what anthropologists call cognitive centering. The hunters just called it respect. Some rituals were shared, others deeply personal. One man might sing to his arrows, another might refuse to speak until the first kill. Women preparing food for returning hunters might place a small piece aside for the spirits, ensuring safe passage. Even children learned these customs by imitation, tracing patterns in ash or tossing pebbles toward the darkness. Each act reinforced a shared delusion, or perhaps a shared truth, that intention could shape outcome. Returning required equal ceremony. You didn't walk back into camp unannounced. Hunters were purified with smoke, greeted with silence before questions. It wasn't hospitality, it was caution. The outside clung to people's sense, energies, moods, and had to be burned off like fever. Among the Cree and Ojibwe, returning hunters sometimes waited outside the firelight for a signal, as if re-entry required customs inspection. Only once the elders nodded could they cross back into the living order. If the hunt had gone badly, or too well, there were extra steps. Failure meant confession. Success meant gratitude. Some people returned, changed, hollow-eyed from what they'd seen or done. Death outside didn't always mean the body died. Sometimes the silence out there got inside the skull and refused to leave. The rituals helped make space for that, a way of saying, you can come back, but leave the wilderness behind. Archaeologists have found evidence of this threshold thinking everywhere. Burned offerings near camp edges, small shrines, objects intentionally broken before travel. These weren't random debris, they were receipts, proof that someone understood how thin the line really was between journey and disappearance. The departure rituals weren't only for the living. When someone didn't return, the same fire became memorial and warning. The smoke rose carrying names, and the story folded into oral maps. That place took one of ours. Over time, geography and grief intertwined until every direction had a ghost attached. Leaving camp, then, wasn't an act of bravery, but of bureaucracy. Every gesture, prayer, and offering filed the right paperwork with existence. Because the wilderness respected no one, but it noticed sincerity. And when the last ember died, when the rituals ended and the watchfires dimmed, what remained wasn't just safety, it was faith disguised as routine. A faith that tomorrow, somehow, the circle would still be there, flickering, warm, and intact, waiting for those who dared to come back. For people who lived one bad decision away from extinction, belief wasn't decoration, it was infrastructure. Survival required faith, the same way lungs require air. Not faith in gods exactly, but in pattern, in meaning, in the idea that existence wasn't just random teeth and weather, because if it was, why bother waking up? Every culture built its theology out of practical experience. The land was too unreliable for worship without accountability. You didn't pray to the sun because it was beautiful. You prayed because last winter it nearly forgot to rise. Spirituality was weather management. Rituals, offerings, taboos, all of them functioned as moral technology. Keep the world talking to you, and maybe it won't swallow you by accident. For the nomads of the Arctic, faith meant trusting the ice not to break and the wind not to change mid-journey. Hunters would whisper to seals before striking, apologizing for the interruption. The act wasn't pity, it was insurance. If the seal's spirit felt respected, the next hunt would go smoother. Reciprocity was theology's first draft. Among the plains people, the same logic applied in different vocabulary. The buffalo wasn't a resource, it was a partner. Killed without gratitude, and the herds would vanish. It wasn't superstition, it was environmental observation centuries before ecology got a name. The divine wasn't up there. It was everywhere you depended on. Faith also worked horizontally between humans. You had to believe your companions wouldn't panic, that someone was watching the fire, that another would track your path if you didn't return. Survival demanded a choreography of trust. Fear could paralyze, but shared belief in the group's rhythm kept movement possible. Anthropologists might call that collective cohesion. The old hunters just called it staying alive together. Even despair found structure. When illness struck or famine hit, prayers weren't about comfort, but continuity. Words to keep the psychological machinery from seizing. The Cree sang to the sick, not to heal them, but to remind the living they still knew the words. Faith's function wasn't fixing the unfixable, it was preventing collapse. Over time, these survival rituals turned into cosmologies. The fire became the sun's small reflection. The camp, the model of the universe. The circle of safety mirrored the order of creation. Humans weren't just surviving, they were rehearsing the myth of endurance. And endurance, in a world designed to erase you, was the only real religion. What makes this worldview haunting isn't its strangeness, but its accuracy. The modern world still runs on the same operating system. Only now we've renamed it hope. We still light fires against the dark, still trust systems we can't fully see, still convince ourselves that meaning will save us from randomness. The people who came before simply did it more honestly. They knew survival wasn't evidence of strength, it was grace, luck, and attention, all pretending to be courage. They lived each day as a small miracle too exhausted to advertise itself. And every night, when the fire dimmed and the horizon reclaimed the world, they sat with that quiet understanding that life, for all its brutality, continued anyway, stubborn, uninvited, and somehow faithful to itself. Courage, at least the way modern people like to imagine it, wears armor and looks good in slow motion. Its cinematic teeth gritted, hair conveniently tousled, maybe a dramatic orchestral swell in the background. But for most of human history, courage was less glamorous. It smelled like sweat, hunger, and mild regret. The kind of courage that mattered didn't come from speeches or ideals. It came from situations so bad that hesitation meant death. Anthropologists who've spent their lives decoding heroic behavior among traditional societies often sound disappointed. There's rarely a clean line between bravery and panic. The San hunter who walks alone into the Kalahari heat to track a wounded antelope isn't trying to prove a point. He's trying to eat. The Inuit man who ventures onto new ice knows exactly how thin it is, but the seal's hull won't wait for safer weather. These aren't stories of fearlessness. They're stories of necessity dressed in competence. The difference between a hero and a survivor was mostly luck and insulation. When anthropologists ask elders to describe courage, they don't get abstract philosophy. They get stories about weather, stomachs, and stubbornness. In the Arctic, bravery is walking into a blizzard because the dogs still need food. Among plains hunters, it's crossing open grasslands knowing there are men out there who'd love to turn you into a moral lesson. In the Amazon, courage means sticking your hand into a glove full of bullet ants, not to prove dominance, but to remember the lineage that expects it. The pain isn't symbolic, it's curriculum. The irony is that early courage had no audience. There was no one to applaud, no chronicler to immortalize it, no audience besides the occasional raven. It existed purely in function. You did the terrifying thing, and if you survived, you did it again tomorrow. Glory was a side effect, invented much later, mostly by people far away from the situations that required actual risk. Civilizations always romanticize what they no longer have to do. It's easy to praise courage when your biggest danger is public speaking. Bravery in small-scale societies was also deeply unromantic because it was repetitive. Every generation faced the same risks: starvation, predation, childbirth, injury, and the same limited options. You couldn't outsource courage. It was a family business. Myths of heroes existed, yes, but they weren't recruitment posters. They were cautionary tales disguised as instruction manuals. The message was never be fearless. It was try not to make the same mistakes. But if you must, at least make them memorably. Even the word fearless would have sounded ridiculous to most people before modern comfort dulled danger. Fear wasn't something to overcome. It was a survival mechanism to negotiate with the warrior, the hunter, the midwife. None of them denied fear. They carried it like an extra tool, heavy but necessary. The sand trackers say fear sharpens your eyes, not your ego. The Inuits say fear keeps the ice honest. The point was never to feel brave, it was to function while terrified. But somewhere between the campfire and the printing press, courage got rebranded. The poets got involved. The soldiers of empires, the adventurers of exploration, they started rewriting necessity as destiny. Bravery became something ornamental, something people practiced for pride instead of hunger. The stories got cleaner, the blood dried, and the version of courage that once smelled of salt and smoke became a word we use when someone jumps out of an airplane for fun. Yet under the mythology, the real version never went away. It still exists in the quiet gestures. The Arctic fisherman who rows out into fog, knowing the sea doesn't owe him a return. Or the woman in the desert who walks 20 miles for water because her child is crying. Courage isn't loud, it's logistical. And in that silence between pulse and panic, between choice and reflex, something primitive still lives. The original bargain between fear and survival. It's not beautiful, but it works. And hunger, as it turns out, had a way of making even the most reluctant heart walk straight into danger. It wasn't philosophy that taught humans bravery, it was an empty stomach. Hunger has always been a merciless instructor, the kind that doesn't believe in theory or mercy. You could pray, you could sing, you could even philosophize, but at the end of the day, hunger was the only god that guaranteed obedience. Archaeologists have found traces of this brutal curriculum everywhere. Spear tips buried deep in mammoth ribs, fishing hooks carved from bone, worn paths leading from safe caves into open plains. Each artifact, in essence, is a fossilized act of courage. The sand didn't chase kudu across blistering desert for fun. The Inuit didn't build seal hunting platforms over breathing holes for adventure. These weren't hobbies. They were negotiations with death for calories. Among many hunter-gatherer groups, hunger wasn't just a condition, it was a rhythm. The Kung of the Kalahari knew the desert well enough to measure time by the space between meals. They followed migratory herds across salt plains, balancing the fine line between starvation and exhaustion. In the Arctic, hunger meant learning which parts of a walrus could be eaten raw without inviting parasites. On the plains, it meant memorizing the way buffalo herds moved across grass that could hide both food and death. Every act of bravery was, at its core, a logistical decision made under duress. You didn't wake up wanting to test your limits. You woke up wanting to not die. The courage to hunt was inseparable from the fear of not eating. Anthropologists studying Inuit hunting rituals describe an eerie practicality before a hunt. Men would speak softly to their tools, not out of superstition, but concentration. The knife wasn't sacred, it was the line between famine and survival. Hunger also made cooperation mandatory. Among the Hadza, even the best hunters couldn't predict when their next meal would come, so meat was shared. Sharing wasn't moral, it was insurance. Refusing to distribute food meant isolation, and isolation in a landscape that didn't care about your ego was a death sentence. Courage here wasn't individual glory, it was collective endurance. A good hunter wasn't brave because he killed, he was brave because he kept feeding people who'd one day need to feed him. It's telling that in so many early languages, words for hunger and fear share roots or rhythmic similarity. Both triggered the same physiological alarms, both demanded movement. You didn't think, you tracked, climbed, ran, endured. Hunger stripped the intellect bare and left only the instinct to act. And that, paradoxically, was where courage was born, not in the absence of fear, but in the refusal to sit still in its company. Even myth kept its distance from comfort. In some Arctic traditions, hunger was personified as a visitor, a skeletal guest who arrived uninvited, whispering advice that sounded a lot like desperation. In Plains folklore, starvation tested a man's worth, not through battle but through restraint. How long could he last before eating his own supplies, or worse, his horse? Hunger wasn't just a punishment, it was pedagogy. And once you learned its lessons, you never forgot them. A full stomach could make people lazy, soft, dangerously confident. But those who'd known real hunger carried an invisible scar, a memory in the gut that hummed whenever food grew scarce again. It wasn't trauma so much as awareness, that bravery, like hunger, always returned. Even now, centuries later, in air-conditioned comfort and abundance, humanity still performs small rituals of courage that mimic the same primitive hunger: the fasting athlete, the ascetic monk, the adrenaline junkie pretending danger has meaning. They're all reenacting an ancient rehearsal for survival, because the first thing hunger ever taught us was this: fear won't kill you, hesitation will. And if hunger was the first teacher, fear was the tutor who made sure you never forgot your lessons. If hunger was the spark, fear was the structure. It built the reflexes, rewired the senses, and wrote the manual on what not to do twice. Fear, contrary to the modern branding, wasn't a weakness. It was the best teacher the species ever had. The problem is that its classes were always mandatory and never comfortable. Early life didn't allow for bravery without caution. Among hunter-gatherer groups, the people who ignored fear didn't become heroes. They became anecdotes. The Hadza, the Inuit, the Iwenki, all knew that courage meant knowing precisely when to tremble. Anthropologists noticed something almost paradoxical. The most skilled hunters were the ones who admitted fear openly. They treated it as an instrument, not an obstacle. It was a barometer that told them when the ice was too thin, the wind too strong, or the silence too absolute. Fear didn't paralyze, it focused. Among the Inuit, boys were taught early to listen to fear. If the hair on your neck rose near a crack in the ice, you turned back, not because you were weak, but because your body remembered something you didn't. In the Amazon, hunters described fear as an echo from the forest. When they stopped hearing it, they knew they were in trouble. Overconfidence meant forgetting how to interpret the silence before disaster. This wasn't superstition, it was empirical. Fear heightened pattern recognition, an evolutionary feedback loop between anxiety and awareness. A plains hunter could sense a shift in the wind that modern instruments barely register. A sand tracker could tell from a single bent blade of grass whether an antelope had passed an hour or a day ago. Fear made the world louder, more detailed, more alive. It wasn't poetic instinct, it was data processed by nerves. The modern myth says fear must be conquered, but for most of human history, fear was domesticated instead, managed, cultivated, and consulted like an elder with bad manners but good advice. Every culture had rituals to shape it. Some Arctic shamans taught apprentices to spend nights alone on ice floes, not to erase fear, but to give it boundaries. The fear didn't disappear, it became directional. Like a compass, it always pointed toward the thing that could kill you next. And it wasn't just physical survival. Fear enforced etiquette in tribal law systems without prisons. Fear of shame or supernatural retribution kept order. The Hopi word for fear, kui, also implied respect. A reminder that some forces weren't to be tested. It was a built-in social contract. If you don't fear anything, you endanger everyone. Fear kept the world coherent. You can almost track humanity's decline in common sense by watching where we stopped listening to it. The farther society got from immediate danger, the louder it had to fake courage. Soldiers in formation replaced hunters in silence. Marching replaced stalking. And somewhere between the invention of cities and the invention of bureaucracy, fear went from sacred tutor to bad PR. But in the old days, fear wasn't an emotional inconvenience. It was a finely tuned sense of physics, weather, and consequence. It taught balance literally. The Yakut hunters who rode reindeer across cracked ice learned to feel vibration through their ankles before sound reached their ears. They didn't trust words, they trusted pulse. Fear was a translation of environment into sensation. Even in art, fear built discipline. The rituals before hunts, the chants before raids, the prayers before childbirth, all served one purpose: to keep the mind from fracturing under the pressure of awareness. Every beat of a drum, every repeated word, every painted symbol told the brain, you are afraid, but you are still here. And sometimes that reminder was the difference between instinct and panic. So when people today say they conquered fear, they sound a little naive. Our ancestors didn't conquer it. They signed a treaty with it, one that guaranteed mutual survival as long as both sides kept their distance. And from that uneasy alliance came the next invention, ritual, the human way of pretending. Control over forces that never really belonged to us. Humans, being terminally anxious, have always preferred fear with choreography. It's one thing to risk death, it's another to schedule it. That's essentially what ritual did. It turned chaos into a calendar. Every terrifying act, from hunting to childbirth to battle, got wrapped in ceremony like a dangerous object padded with meaning. The body could tremble, but at least it knew when to start and when to stop. You can trace this pattern across every corner of the world. The plains hunters painted their bodies before chasing buffalo not to look heroic, but to prepare the nervous system. Among the Inuit, men rubbed seal oil on their faces and murmured to the wind before stepping onto new ice. The Amazonian satyr, more boys, famously shoved their hands into gloves full of bullet ants, a ritual so painful it borders on theater. Yet none of this was for spectacle. These were rehearsals, psychological conditioning sessions wrapped in myth. The ritual was the software update that kept panic from crashing the operating system. Anthropologists used to call such practices rites of passage, which sounds poetic until you realize what it meant. State-sanctioned trauma. Fear was institutionalized, standardized, even aestheticized. Each community had its own way of saying, yes, this will hurt, but you'll come out changed. The Maasai lion hunt, for example, wasn't about heroism, it was about synchronizing adrenaline. The young men moved, breathed, and struck together. Individual fear dissolved into rhythm. What looked like courage was just cohesion in motion. It's the same logic behind Arctic endurance rituals. Some Inuit groups required adolescent boys to spend nights alone on the ice to learn the difference between fear and hallucination. They returned either calmer or less vocal, both outcomes acceptable. And in the desert cultures of North Africa, fasting before a hunt was a neurological trick. Starve yourself, dull the body's noise, and the mind becomes sharper. Pain and deprivation weren't punishments, they were calibration tools. Rituals also gave people a script for interacting with the unpredictable. When the world could kill you without warning via flood, famine, or a misplaced footstep ceremony, created the illusion of predictability. Offerings, songs, gestures, these weren't primitive superstitions, they were emotional technologies. To whisper to the forest before entering it was a way of lowering the heart rate. To paint your face with ochre before battle was to tell your brain, I've done this before, and I'm still alive. Even modern soldiers unknowingly copy this pattern, polishing boots, checking weapons, repeating prayers, touching talismans. Ritual remains the only socially acceptable way to negotiate fear without admitting to it. The repetition doesn't protect from danger, but it protects from paralysis. Anthropologists like Victor Turner call this the liminal state, that blurry threshold where chaos becomes sacred simply because it's unbearable otherwise. Ritualized danger also served an economic purpose. In societies where hunting and warfare were essential, keeping fear functional was a public good. Communities couldn't afford panic, so fear became cultural property, shaped, timed, and redistributed. You didn't get to be scared alone. Your fear belonged to the group, just like your food. The irony, of course, is that ritual didn't reduce risk, it romanticized it. But that romance had function. The painted faces, the chants, the symbolic offerings, they all softened the brutality of reality by wrapping it in story. Danger became performance, and performance gave danger dignity. And when that collective theater ended, when the chants faded and the drums went quiet, what was left wasn't relief, it was connection. Fear, once shared, became trust, and that trust, in turn, was what made courage sustainable. Because bravery alone could get you killed. But bravery, rehearsed and synchronized, that could build an entire civilization. And soon, courage stopped being a solo act altogether. It became a group assignment, one where everyone's heartbeat had to fall in rhythm with everyone else's. No one survived alone. The lone hero, that cinematic orphan of modern imagination, would have lasted about a day and a half in the Paleolithic. Real courage wasn't solo, it was choreographed. Fear was collective property, and so was bravery. The rhythm of survival required more than skill. It required harmony, that subtle alignment of movement, sound, and trust that turned a fragile group of humans into a functioning organism. Anthropologists who've studied traditional hunting parties notice something uncanny. They move like one body with many limbs. Among the Inuit, a seal hunt might involve 10 men spaced across the ice, each listening for faint breaths under the surface. One cough could ruin the entire day. Among the Hadza, hunters in the bush communicate in whispers and hand signs, each step a vote of confidence that everyone else knows what they're doing. Among the Plains nations, buffalo hunts demanded a full choreography, horse riders circling, decoy fires lit, signals passed between ridges, Monsieur Q, and people starved. There was no glory in freelancing. Even warfare, often romanticized as the ultimate test of individual courage, was built on the same communal spine. Early war bands, like those of the Comanche or the Dean, relied on synchronization, not heroics. Anthropologist Richard Lee once wrote that courage among egalitarian groups wasn't about dominance, but reliability. The brave one was the person who didn't break formation when things went wrong. In other words, courage was consistency under threat. That's why so many rituals before battle or hunt involved song. Singing wasn't just morale, it was metronome. It aligned heartbeats, breathing, tempo. It made courage a bodily contagion, one person's steadiness transmitting invisibly to the next. Modern neuroscience would call that co-regulation. The old hunters would have called it just staying alive together. Even domestic life relied on collective bravery. The women who kept the fires burning while men hunted faced their own version of exposure, childbirth, illness, famine. Among the Iroquois, female councils decided whether the nation went to war. Among the Inuit, women managed the supplies that kept camps from freezing. There was courage in the act of feeding, of maintaining balance under strain. The group didn't divide bravery by gender, it distributed it by necessity. This collective model of courage also explains why ancient punishments for cowardice were so severe. Cowardice wasn't just moral failure, it was infrastructural collapse. One person's panic could break the rhythm, and when rhythm broke, death entered. To flee a hunt or betray a watch shift wasn't shameful, it was homicidal negligence. The community had no room for individual emotion once the ritual began. Courage was choreography, and choreography was survival. Modern people still mimic this in diluted form. Soldiers march in formation for the same reason hunters once moved in lines through grass. It's easier to be brave when your body isn't the only one trembling. Firefighters, climbers, surgeons, they all perform rituals of trust, unspoken cues that signal, "I'll hold steady if you do." The species still fears chaos, so it keeps inventing systems to pretend it's in control of it. In small-scale societies, courage was rarely celebrated out loud. Praise could destabilize humility, and humility was what kept the system from cracking. After a dangerous hunt, there were no speeches, no applause. The hunter returned, set down the meat, and joined the circle like nothing happened. To boast was to separate oneself from the rhythm, to claim solo authorship of survival, a sacrilege in a world that punished arrogance with silence. The group remembered who flinched, who steadied, who watched. They remembered, but they didn't say. Courage existed not in narrative, but in repetition, in the continued trust that tomorrow, everyone would still move together. And within that quiet collective endurance, another truth emerged, that courage wore many faces, not all of them male, loud, or armed. Some of them gave birth, buried the dead, carried the wounded, or kept the fire from going out in the wind. Which is why, when people today say bravery, they usually picture a man with a weapon, and forget the 1,000 invisible acts of courage that held his world together. For all its talk of warriors and hunts, courage was never a male monopoly. The stage just had better lighting for the ones holding spears. Behind every legend of a hunter who faced a lion stood a woman who faced a birth that could kill her faster. Different settings, same physiology, pulse quickened, breath shallow, body negotiating with pain. One did it in open air, the other in silence, both in service of survival. Among the Inuit, childbirth was the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. There were no midwives with sterile tools, only trusted hands and whispered songs to distract from the sound of bones shifting. Anthropologists recorded women comparing labor to hunting. You prepared, you endured, and if you lived, you thanked what you couldn't name. Among the dying, women prayed to changing woman not for ease, but for endurance. That thin, stubborn thread between agony and surrender. The men went to battle. The women stayed with life's bloodiest logistics. In matrilineal societies, like the Iroquois Confederacy, female courage wasn't just biological, it was political. Women controlled land, lineage, and the decision to go to war. They were the quiet governors of risk. If courage among men meant taking life, among women it meant deciding when that taking was worth it. Authority, in that sense, was the highest form of bravery, to bear responsibility for collective survival while knowing the consequences would arrive on your doorstep. Then there's the daily courage that never made it into myth, the endurance of famine, of raising children through migration, of tending the fires when the world outside froze. Arctic women spent winters scraping hides until their fingers cracked, sewing clothes that would decide whether the next blizzard was survivable. Plains women butchered, cooked, tanned, and stored a cycle of invisible heroism disguised as duty. No one sang about them because no one stopped long enough to notice that comfort had a cost. Even in cultures that ritualized male suffering, like the Plains Sundance or Amazonian pain trials, there were parallel forms of female endurance. In some Amazonian groups, girls underwent isolation rituals at puberty, fasting and bleeding alone in huts to learn patience and restraint. Courage here wasn't performance, it was privacy. To survive solitude without losing the mind required a steadiness that made open combat look easy. Anthropologists have long struggled with how to name these forms of bravery. Resilience, they called it, as if patience were passive. But the truth is, women's courage was the infrastructure of the species. They faced repetition instead of climax, the kind of slow danger that comes not from a single strike, but from the accumulation of exhaustion. Where male courage tended to peak, female courage endured. One burned bright, the other smoldered for decades. Even death had gender. Men risked it in public, women met it in private. Yet across cultures, both sides shared a strange symmetry. The same songs sung for hunters lost to predators were sung for mothers lost to childbirth. The same words, different contexts, both recognized that courage and suffering were twins born of necessity. So when historians label courage as heroic, they're really describing its loudest version. But the quiet forms, the ones whispered, wept, or hidden behind closed hides, were older, steadier, and statistically far more common. And from those quiet, enduring acts of repetition came another ritual, one that taught humans how to transform pain into wisdom, and fear into ceremony. Pain, contrary to modern sensibilities, used to be the curriculum. It taught what words couldn't, and reminded the body who was really in charge. Long before anyone built schools or churches, the human nervous system was the first classroom, and every lesson began with discomfort. Across cultures, pain wasn't random cruelty, it was pedagogy. Among the Arctic peoples, boys were sent to stand barefoot on ice as a test of stillness, learning how to breathe through cold without losing awareness. In the Amazon, the Satamar's bullet ant ritual turned agony into initiation, not as spectacle, but as a neurological training exercise. The goal wasn't to prove toughness, it was to practice existing inside unbearable sensations without breaking. It's hard to panic when you've already met pain and learned it speaks your language. The Plains nations held similar logics. During the Sundance, participants pierced their chests with bone skewers tethered to a central pole. They danced until the skin tore, not in pursuit of masochism, but transcendence. Anthropologists who observed the ritual noted the paradoxical calm in participants' faces. Pain, once accepted, ceased to be chaos. It became rhythm, breath, endurance. The ceremony wasn't about suffering, it was about precision. The dancer's body turned agony into geometry. This principle ran deep. To know oneself was to know one's threshold. Among the Dene and Cree, winter isolation tests forced adolescents to sit in frozen silence for hours, motionless, hungry, alert. The lesson wasn't bravery, it was self-regulation. Courage, they understood, wasn't a feeling but a physiological literacy. Pain was a teacher that demanded attention, not defiance. Even beyond formal rituals, pain structured the ordinary. Every act of survival involved small, repetitive discomforts, cracked hands, frostbitten cheeks, the slow ache of labor. The body adapted, catalogued, remembered. Over time, communities embedded these micropains into their identity. To flinch less was to belong more. Modern anthropology calls this pain socialization. The old languages had better words for it, usually meaning to grow inside suffering without bitterness. There was even a spiritual dimension. In the Andes, fasting before ritual meant thinning the boundary between body and spirit. In the Arctic, self-inflicted wounds were offered to appease the sea goddess Sedna, not out of guilt, but negotiation. Pain was currency. It proved sincerity in a universe that didn't trust words alone. What fascinates researchers now is how pain bridged biology and belief. It changed brain chemistry, yes, but it also created cohesion. Shared pain made trust tangible. Those who bled together quite literally bonded, not in metaphor, but in measurable neurological synchrony. Group rituals that involved endurance, forged empathy. A civilization can't run on empathy alone, but it certainly collapses faster without it. And there was an honesty to it, a brutal one. You can't fake pain. In societies where survival hinged on authenticity, suffering was a lie detector. The one who endured was reliable. The one who avoided discomfort was suspicious. Trust wasn't granted through promises. It was earned through scars. The modern world avoids pain, sterilizes it, medicates it, files it under unnecessary. But for most of history, pain was the teacher no one could drop. It shaped patience, restraint, and most importantly, humility. Because nothing humbles the ego faster than realizing the body will always vote last. And after the lesson came the inheritance, the traditions that turned every scar, every ritual wound, into a map of who you were and who you were expected to become. Tradition is what happens when fear becomes memory, and memory becomes rule. It begins as a habit, the way ancestors held a spear or crossed a river, and hardens over time into something sacred, untouchable, unquestionable. What once was improvisation becomes theology. Courage stops being an event and starts being an inheritance. In small-scale societies, the past wasn't something that sat quietly behind you. It was the oxygen you breathed. Every act, hunting, mourning, marriage, even walking the right direction around a fire, carried ancestral fingerprints. The Inuit, for instance, followed migration routes first traced generations earlier, even when ice conditions changed. To deviate wasn't innovation, it was arrogance. You trusted the ghosts, who knew the terrain better than you ever would. The same logic guided the Dine shepherds through the desert and the Mbori fishermen across the Pacific. Tradition was a GPS written in bone and myth. The weight of that inheritance wasn't symbolic, it was physical. Plains warriors carried the painted shields of their fathers, not for sentimental reasons, but because every dent told a story of what worked. Ancestral equipment wasn't relic, it was empirical data. Among the Ewenki reindeer herders of Siberia, the routes between grazing grounds were passed down orally, each landmark infused with taboo and story. You didn't just move animals, you moved memory. One wrong turn could mean starvation, but worse, it meant dishonor. This collective adherence to the past made courage predictable. No one needed to ask, how do we act in danger? Because the script was already written centuries before. Among the Cree, certain hunting songs were sung not for motivation, but calibration. The same melody, the same sequence, each verse anchoring the body into continuity. Ritual repetition turned panic into choreography. You weren't brave, you were rehearsed. But tradition also made the world heavier. You didn't just carry your own fear, you carried everyone's before you. Breaking a taboo wasn't merely personal error, it was cosmic vandalism. The Innu believed that ignoring ancestral instructions could bring storms, illness, or bad hunts. The Maasai taught that the courage of the ancestors could literally abandon a coward, leaving his body unprotected. To defy custom was to walk alone in a universe designed for company. And yet, within that rigidity, there was comfort. To inherit courage meant never facing the unknown completely naked. The ritual, the chant, the order of operations, all of it was scaffolding for the terrified mind. Modern anthropology might call it cultural continuity, but the people living it would have said it simply, we do as they did. So the world stays kind. It's easy to romanticize that now, to imagine noble ancestors guiding trembling descendants through fog and danger. But the truth is more pragmatic. Tradition was a survival mechanism disguised as faith. It didn't guarantee safety. It guaranteed consistency, and in an unpredictable world, consistency was a miracle. Still, the cost of inherited courage was stagnation. The moment you innovated under pressure, you risked breaking the chain. Every new method, every shortcut, had to pass through a moral filter. Does it honor the dead? Does it offend the gods? Courage wasn't personal expression. It was a form of obedience, and that obedience became theater. Every hunt, every battle, every ceremony turned into a performance, not just for the living, but for the unseen audience of ancestors who had to be convinced that their descendants still deserved luck. And when courage became performance, it stopped being private. Every movement, every gesture, every drop of sweat was watched, measured, and remembered. Once courage became ritual, it inevitably became performance. There was no escaping the audience, not when your entire existence depended on convincing everyone, living and dead, that you knew what you were doing. Bravery was no longer a feeling. It was choreography under surveillance. Among plains hunters, returning from the field wasn't just a homecoming, it was theater. The hunter didn't speak first, his scars did. The village would gather, eyes scanning for proof that he'd faced danger properly. The cuts, the blood, the trophies. If the story matched the body became a story. To show no wound at all, though that was suspicious. Too much perfection reeked of cowardice or luck, both equally shameful. Pain was social currency. You displayed it to be believed. Across the Arctic, the same logic appeared in quieter form. Among the Inuit hunters who survived perilous journeys recited their experiences in measured tones, stripped of exaggeration. The rule was simple: tell what happened, not how it made you feel. Emotion was indulgence. Accuracy was respect. The act of retelling wasn't confession, it was preservation. Listeners weren't there to applaud. They were there to memorize, to study, to inherit the caution embedded between the lines. Courage, in this sense, was never spontaneous. It was rehearsed again, and finally performed under the expectation of continuity. A brave act didn't end when the danger did. It ended when the community decided it had been properly translated. Among the Ambori, a warrior's courage wasn't sealed until it was sung. The war chant, the haka, didn't just describe valor, it reanimated it. Through rhythm, posture, and voice, courage was made public property. Even fear required stage management. The Kwakitel of the Pacific Northwest performed elaborate winter ceremonies where initiates were possessed by spirits and then symbolically tamed by the community. Beneath the masks and firelight, what was really being trained wasn't mysticism, it was composure. The young learned to move through terror without breaking character. To perform courage was to reprogram panic. And of course, there was propaganda. Leaders learned early that courage needed witnesses, and witnesses needed editing. Egyptian pharaohs carved impossible victories into stone. Aztec priests recorded conquests as divine inevitabilities. Every ruler throughout history has known that courage decays without documentation. That's why oral societies turn to song, and literate ones to monument. Heroism has always needed PR. What made this system so durable was reciprocity. The brave acted for the crowd, and the crowd repaid them with memory. In many plains cultures, that was the true immortality. To have one's name attached to a moment of composure under chaos. It wasn't glory, it was insurance. You endured, the group endured, and your story kept the next generation from freezing at the wrong time. The price, however, was exhaustion. Living inside a performance meant never being allowed to tremble in peace. To falter publicly could undo years of steady rhythm. Anthropologists studying warrior societies noted the after effect, the quiet withdrawal, the insomnia, the ritual purification. Even courage, once spent, left a residue of fear that had to be cleaned off. And that's where courage's illusion cracked. Beneath the applause, beneath the songs, the trembling always returned. Courage was never about feeling fearless. It was about managing visibility. You could be terrified privately, as long as the public saw composure. But fear doesn't stay buried forever. It lingers, seeps, stains. And after the performance, when the fires died down and the crowd dispersed, the bravest people often sat awake the longest, trying to remember how to be ordinary again. Which is why the final act of courage was never the battle or the hunt. It was what came after, when silence arrived and no one was watching. Every performance ends with silence, and silence is where courage stops pretending. When the noise fades, the painted faces wash off, and the fires shrink to coals, something fragile and unscripted returns. The tremor, the same one that was carefully hidden under rhythm, ritual, and stoicism. Because courage, for all its spectacle, has always been a temporary costume worn over panic. After great danger, traditional societies didn't celebrate, they purified. The plains warriors who returned from raids entered sweat lodges, not to boast, but to sweat out what clung to them. The Apache fasted, the Inuit bathed in cold water and rubbed their bodies with snow. All were variations of the same idea: cleanse the residue of fear before it curdled into something worse. They understood what modern people rebranded as trauma long before psychology had a word for it. Terror had weight. It stayed in the body, made the heart pound at strange hours, turned dreams into warnings. Among the Dene, warriors spoke of the echo of the hunt, the way the mind kept replaying the sound